In the 8th century, the Islamic Empire was experiencing this economic and cultural boom that is, honestly, it's just really hard to wrap our modern minds around.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we are talking about unprecedented wealth just flooding into cities like Baghdad and Basra.
Right, you have these sprawling palatial architectural projects, markets just completely overflowing with Byzantine silks, exotic spices, and, this burgeoning upper class that is suddenly very, very comfortable.
Extremely comfortable, and it changed the entire social fabric.
Yeah, but here's the thing. If you wanted to protest this extreme wealth, if you looked at all this luxury and thought, wow, we have completely lost the plot of our religion, you didn't hold up a protest sign.
No, definitely not.
You didn't write an angry op-ed.
Yeah.
You went out, you found the cheapest, itchiest, most visually offensive, coarse wool garment you could possibly find. You put it on, and you basically refused to ever take it off.
Yeah, it was the ultimate anti-fashion statement. And it wasn't just about being uncomfortable for the sake of it, right? It was a deeply public, visceral rejection of what society was becoming.
Exactly.
They were literally turning their own bodies into a critique of the empire.
Right. Which is wild to think about.
Yeah.
So today we are taking a deep dive into this incredibly rich stack of historical sources, theological treatises, and archival research detailing the evolution of Sufism.
It's a fascinating stack of documents.
It really is. And our mission here is to trace how a very raw, very unorganized movement of people who, like we said, were basically just wearing itchy shirts make a point, somehow evolved into one of the most complex, fiercely debated, and profound psychological and philosophical sciences of the human soul.
Because for anyone listening right now, your primary association with Sufism is, well, it's likely the highly sanitized, incredibly poetic version we see today.
Oh, for sure, the Instagram version.
Exactly. Rumi quotes superimposed over beautiful landscapes, the mesmerizing spin of the whirling dervishes, this like universal language of divine love.
Right.
But the material we are going through today paints a wildly different picture of its origins. I mean, we are looking at a history that is gritty. It's filled with bitter rivalries, with orthodox scholars, intense psychological deconstruction, and claims of cosmic superpowers that literally had people accused of heresy.
Yeah, it's not all just nice poetry. We are going to decode a centuries-old linguistic mystery about where they even got their name. Because, fun fact, they didn't name themselves initially.
Yeah, they definitely didn't.
We'll explore their almost terrifyingly strict mapping of human psychology and look at some mind-bending philosophical shifts that caused massive societal whiplash.
Huge whiplash.
And finally, we're going to look at how a revolutionary freed slave woman single-handedly shifted the entire vocabulary of a world religion.
It's quite a journey.
So let's start at the very beginning, before the poetry, before the whirling. Let's look at the time when this group didn't even have a title. Because reading through the history, it's wild to realize that early Muslims didn't even use a specific word to describe, mystics.
Right. And to understand why they didn't have a name, we really have to look at the social hierarchy of the very first generation of Islam.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So in that initial period, the absolute apex of societal and spiritual status was captured by a single title, which was the Sahaba, or the companions of the Prophet.
Right.
If you lived during that time and interacted with the Prophet Muhammad, you held that title. And there was simply no higher tier of piety you could claim.
It was the ultimate status.
Exactly. And the generation that followed them also had a simple universal title, the Tabi'un, meaning the followers.
And I think what the sources show is that in those early days, extreme piety, living minimally, giving away your wealth, that wasn't a niche subculture.
No, not at all.
It was the baseline expectation. You didn't need a special badge or a club name to announce that you were a deeply devoted person who didn't care about money, because pretty much everyone you respected was living exactly that way.
Right, but sociologically, baseline shift. So fast forward to the 2nd century after the Hijra, so roughly the late 700s and 800s CE.
Okay.
The borders of the empire have expanded massively. The wealth we mentioned earlier is completely transforming the culture. The sources document a distinct shift where mainstream society starts heavily engaging with the world.
They're building generational wealth.
Yes, investing in massive estates, enjoying fine foods, the whole 9 yards.
So the era of the scrappy underdog is over. The boom times have arrived.
Exactly, and suddenly the individuals who still desperately wanted to live that raw, stripped-down, intense lifestyle of the first generation, They looked around and realized they were completely
It
alienated.
stuck out like a sore thumb.
They really did. They were no longer the norm. They were a glaring exception. And on top of that, you had various political and theological sects emerging all over the empire, each claiming to be the true inheritors of the faith.
Right. Everyone's claiming they have the real truth.
Yeah. So these intensely devout mainstream Sunni Muslims needed a new identifier. They needed a way to signal to each other and to the world that they were actively opting out of the luxury that everyone else was chasing.
So initially, the sources indicate they just leaned on descriptive adjectives, right?
Yay.
Like they were called zuhad, meaning ascetics,
Mm.
the people who actively renounce worldly things.
Right.
Or they were called ubad, which just means worshipers, like people who spend an unnatural amount of time engaged in prayer.
Just nonstop praying. Yeah.
But somewhere along the line, before the year 200 AH, this entirely new term drops into the lexicon and gains massive fame: the Sufi.
The Sufi, yes.
Yeah. And reading through this scholarly debate on exactly when and where this word first appeared is, I mean, it's like watching two historians have a polite, passive-aggressive wrestling match.
Oh, it is fiercely debated. I mean, on one side of the ring, you have this foundational figure named Abu Nasr al-Siraj.
Right, the 10th century guy.
Exactly. He wrote a text in the 10th century called the Book of Flashes, which is essentially one of the first major attempts to legitimize Sufism to the broader public.
Kind of like a PR campaign for them?
In a way, yes. Al-Siraj argues that the term Sufi is ancient. He really wants to prove it existed almost from the beginning of the religion.
And he tells this story, right, about Hassan al-Basri, who is this legendary early ascetic. Hassan supposedly meets a guy doing the tawaf, the circumambulation around the Kaaba in Mecca.
Right, walking around the Kaaba.
And Hassan tries to hand the man some charity, but the guy waves him off and says, "No thanks, I already have 4 dawanik," which are just these tiny, almost worthless coins.
Barely enough to buy a piece of bread.
Yeah. He basically says, "I have enough to survive today, why would I take more?" And al-Siraj uses this anecdote to declare, look, Hassan al-Basri called this man a Sufi. The term was known way back then.
Right.
He even goes so far as to claim there are oral traditions of a solitary Sufi visiting an empty Kaaba before Islam even existed.
Which is, frankly, a classic example of retroactive historical branding. Al-Siraj is trying to build a pedigree.
He's padding the resume.
Exactly. But modern historical analysis pushes back on this hard. You have Louis Massignon, a 20th century scholar who did exhaustive, meticulous archival work on early Islamic mysticism.
He's the guy who really dug into the municipal records.
Yes, and Massignon completely dismantles al-Siraj's timeline. Through looking at those records and early texts, Massignon traces the very first singular use of the word Sufi as a specific title to Baghdad.
Okay, to a specific person.
Yes, he pins it to a man named Abdak al-Sufi, who died around 210 AH.
And what I find absolutely fascinating about Abdak al-Sufi is that he wasn't some universally beloved mainstream saint. He was deeply controversial.
Extremely controversial. Massignon highlights that Abdak was a strict vegetarian ascetic.
Which doesn't sound crazy to us today, but back then.
In the context of that society, refusing to eat meat wasn't seen as a health choice or a modern ethical stance. It was viewed by some Orthodox scholars as borderline heretical.
Wait, heretical? Just for not eating meat?
Yeah, because it implied you were forbidding something that God had explicitly permitted. It was seen as challenging the divine law.
Oh, wow. I never thought of it that way.
Right. And Massignon's research also reveals that before the term became a widespread umbrella for mysticism, it was highly localized. It popped up as a derogatory term for Shiite ascetics in the city of Kufa, and was even used to describe a specific group of political rebels in Alexandria.
So it starts out almost as a slur. It's a fringe label for dissidents, rebels, and, weirdos who won't eat meat before it eventually gets reclaimed and elevated into this grand spiritual title.
Exactly. They own the label.
But that still leaves us with the ultimate linguistic mystery. Where does the actual arrangement of letters S, U, F, I come from? Because the theories presented in the historical text range from plausible to absolutely unhinged.
Oh, the linguistic gymnastics that later medieval scholars performed to try and dignify their own name are genuinely entertaining.
They really tried hard.
Because as the movement became more sophisticated and philosophical, they felt embarrassed by the gritty origins of the word. So they tried to reverse engineer a more glamorous etymology.
Let's look at the most popular attempt, the purity theory. A lot of later highly educated mystics love to claim that Sufi derived from the Arabic word safa, which means purity.
Right.
The logic was very poetic. They'd say, we are the people who have purified our hearts from the dirt of the material world, therefore we are the people of Safa.
And thematically, it is a beautiful alignment. It perfectly describes their inner goal, but linguistically, it falls apart the moment you apply basic Arabic grammar.
The grammar police ruin it.
They always do. The 15th century scholar Zakaria al-Ansari, among others, pointed out that if you want to create an adjective describing someone from the root Safa, the morphological rules of Arabic dictate that it would be Safawi, not Sufi.
Right.
To get Sufi from Safa requires completely ignoring how the language functions.
They basically tried to force a square peg into a round linguistic hole just because it sounded better.
Exactly.
Then we have the porch theory, which I actually find really compelling from a historical narrative standpoint.
Yeah.
This theory traces the name back to a specific group called al-Sufa, or the people of the porch.
And this refers to a very real, very famous demographic during the life of the Prophet Muhammad in Medina.
The poorest of the poor.
Yes, these were the migrants who had no family networks, no wealth, no homes. They literally lived on a raised, shaded platform, the Sufa, attached to the Prophet's mosque.
Wow.
And they spent their entire days in worship and learning, relying entirely on communal charity to survive.
I mean, if you are trying to build a spiritual lineage for a movement of extreme ascetics, claiming you are the spiritual descendants of the original homeless worshippers of Medina is brilliant branding. It links you directly to the Prophet's era.
It's the perfect origin story.
But once again, the grammar police ruined the party. The sources clarified that deriving a relational noun from Sufa yields Sufi with a hard double F sound, not the elongated Sufi.
Exactly. The linguistics just don't support it. Then you have theories that try to link it to behavior, like Saf al-Awwal, meaning the first row.
Right, the front row at the mosque.
The idea here is that these individuals are so eager for divine connection that they always sprint to the very first row during congregational prayers.
And then we drop into the theories that just feel like someone was, I don't know, spitballing ideas in a 9th century tavern.
They get pretty creative.
Yeah, one bizarre theory suggests it comes from Sufat al-Kafa, which literally translates to the tuft of hair on the back of the neck.
Right.
The reasoning was that some of these early ascetics were so detached from personal grooming that they let their hair grow wild and matted down their backs.
Which is quite an image.
Truly. And another theory tries to dig into ancient anthropology, claiming the name comes from a pre-Islamic Arab tribe named Sufa, who had a historical role serving the Kaaba in Mecca.
Right, implying the mystics were inheriting that ancient role of service.
But all of these theories are ultimately debunked by the simplest, most historically robust, and grammatically flawless explanation.
The root word is just sif,
Wool.
just wool. Specifically, raw, uncombed, coarse sheep's wool.
Let's talk about the mechanics of wearing this stuff in the Middle East, because it is not the soft merino wool we think of today when we buy a nice sweater.
Oh no, not at all.
This is scratching your skin raw. It's trapping heat in a desert climate, retaining body odor. It is actively hostile to the human body. As the rest of the society was discovering the incredible comfort of imported silk and finely woven Egyptian cotton, these people intentionally put on a hair shirt.
It was a daily physical mechanism of ego suppression. Every time the fabric chafed their skin, it was a tactile reminder that they were not of this world.
It grounds you in discomfort.
Precisely. And al-Sarraj, despite his questionable historical timelines earlier, makes a very sharp observation here about naming conventions. He points out that naming a religious movement after their clothing isn't weird at all.
Right, it happens a lot.
Yeah, he notes that the Quran refers to the disciples of Jesus as the Hawariyun, a word that likely references their distinct white garments, or maybe their profession as bleachers of clothes. So the Sufis were simply named after the most obvious visual thing about them. They were the guys wearing the itchy wool.
I think the best way for a modern listener to grasp how this word evolved is to think about the phrase blue collar.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. If we look at it literally, blue collar refers to the durable denim or chambray work shirts that manual laborers wore in the early 20th century because they hid dirt well. But if I call someone a blue collar guy today, I'm not talking about his wardrobe.
No, you're talking about his values.
Exactly. I'm communicating an entire ethos. I'm saying he values hard work, he's pragmatic, he lacks pretension, he's salt of the earth. The physical shirt evolved into a psychological identity.
And the word Sufi underwent the exact same metamorphosis. It started as the people in the wool, and morphed into an entire worldview.
That parallel captures it perfectly. But that metamorphosis forces us to ask a much larger question. How do you go from a grassroots movement of people wearing itchy shirts in protest to developing an entirely independent, incredibly complex branch of religious science?
Because they didn't just stay a protest movement, they built an intellectual empire.
Which brings us to a massive structural shift in our sources, the Civil War of Sciences. Because in the very early days, Islamic knowledge wasn't segmented, was it?
No, you didn't go to university and major in law while someone else majored in theology. Knowledge was just a holistic pursuit of how to live as a Muslim.
It is all connected.
Right. But as the society exploded in size and complexity, the science of Sharia, the religious law, had to specialize.
And this is where geography becomes destiny. We see two distinct cities developing entirely different intellectual cultures. The city of Kufa, in modern-day Iraq, becomes the absolute powerhouse for fiqh.
Yes.
Let's unpack fiqh for a moment, because understanding it is crucial to understanding the conflict. Fiqh is jurisprudence. It is the granular, highly technical science of the outward law.
It's the rule book.
Exactly. If the empire is going to function, it needs rules. Fiqh dictates the exact wording required to make a marriage contract legally binding. It calculates the fractional mathematics of inheritance law. It dictates the criminal justice system. And, importantly, it dictates the exact physical parameters of ritual worship.
Yes, the external mechanics. Meanwhile, down south, the city of Basra is developing a totally different reputation.
What's happening in Basra?
It becomes the epicenter for extreme asceticism, weeping, and intense prolonged worship. And the prominent scholar Ibn Taymiyyah provides a really fascinating analysis of this early dynamic.
What does he say?
He points out that the ascetics in Basra weren't inventing a new religion. Initially, they were just doing the baseline religion at maximum volume. He uses a specific legal term to describe them. Mujtahids.
Wait, a mujtahid is usually a term reserved for an elite legal scholar, right? Like someone who strives independently to extract a new legal ruling from the texts.
Exactly. And Ibn Taymiyyah argues that just as the brilliant legal minds in Kufa were mujtahids in the realm of law, striving to map out society's rules, the ascetics in Basra were mujtahids in the realm of spiritual devotion.
Ah, I see.
They were pushing the boundaries of human endurance and fasting, night prayers, and poverty.
But pushing those boundaries inevitably led to a fracture, because as the discipline of fiqh matured in Kufa, it became increasingly rigid.
It had to be.
Right. Law requires objectivity. A judge cannot legally measure your feelings. A judge can only measure your actions. Did you wash your arms precisely up to the elbows before the prayer? If yes, the prayer is legally valid. If no, it is invalid. The law focuses entirely on the limbs.
And this is where Sufism steps in to claim the abandoned territory. They look at this massive legal apparatus and realize it has completely ignored the internal human being.
The actual spirit of the thing.
Right. Sufism emerges not as a replacement for the law, but as a parallel science, the science of the heart. It focuses on intentions, ethics, sincerity, and the diseases of the ego like arrogance and envy.
Which, sounds lovely and complimentary on paper, but in reality, it triggered an ideological Cold War.
Oh, major conflict.
The Sufis, emboldened by their intense spiritual experiences, started giving themselves incredibly lofty titles. They called themselves the people of realities or the people of the inward. And then they took aim at the mainstream jurists and the professional scholars in Kufa, and they slapped them with a devastating nickname.
Yes, al-Rusum, the people of traces, or the people of mere outward forms.
That is such a lethal insult in an academic context. I want to explore the mechanics of this critique. What exactly are the Sufis accusing the jurists of doing?
They are accusing them of spiritual taxidermy. The Sufis are arguing that without the inner reality, without pure intention, genuine awe of God, and crushing humility, all of those perfectly executed outward rules are just empty, dead shells. They are just the traces left behind in the sand where a living thing used to be. The Sufi argument is basically, you can perform the physical geometry of the prayer flawlessly according to the legal textbooks of Kufr, but if your heart is distracted by your business deals or filled with pride about how pious you look, your prayer is an empty carcass. It means absolutely nothing.
Ibn al-Qayyim, who is a major critical source in this history, defines this foundational era of Sufism entirely through this lens. He says Sufism, at its core, is just kuluk, which means character or ethics, and irada, the movement or intention of the heart. If you master your character, you have mastered Sufism.
But we really have to look at how this felt from the other side.
Yes. Because imagine being a Supreme Court justice
Yeah.
or a highly educated, deeply respected jurist in Kufa. You have spent 4 decades memorizing tens of thousands of legal precedents.
You are the pillar of the community.
Exactly. You are the reason society isn't collapsing into anarchy.
Yeah.
You resolve property disputes, you protect the rights of orphans through inheritance law, you keep the civilization functioning, and then some guy wanders into your city wearing a filthy, foul-smelling wool cloak, points at your life's work, and publicly declares, you are just a person of mere outward forms. You don't know the real truth.
Wouldn't you be apoplectic?
I would lose my mind.
You would view them as a profound threat to social stability, and the Orthodox scholars did. The friction here is fundamental to human societies.
How so?
While the law relies on measurable objective standards to maintain order, if you allow a group of mystics to claim that religion is entirely about invisible internal realities that only they can perceive, who gets to be the judge?
Right. There's no metric for that.
Exactly. How do you organize a civilization based on the vibes of the heart? It opens the door to total subjective anarchy.
It's the eternal tension between the institutional architects who say we need to keep the trains running on time and the mystical dissidents who say it doesn't matter if the trains are on time if the destination is a spiritual wasteland.
That's beautifully put. And the early Sufi masters were actually very shrewd about this. They recognized the jurist's critique.
They knew they had a point.
Right. They realized that if they just preached vague concepts about having a pure heart, they would be dismissed as unserious hippies. If they were going to claim the territory of the inner heart, they couldn't leave it vague. They had to prove it was a rigorous, mappable science.
They needed their own textbooks.
Exactly. They had to create an internal architecture just as complex and terrifyingly detailed as the external laws of Kufa.
Which opens the door to one of the most fascinating psychological frameworks I've ever encountered. The Sufis literally mapped the human soul.
It's incredible.
They created a highly technical vocabulary for the internal journey, built around two absolute foundational concepts. A wall, which translates to states, and maqamat, which translates to stations. And the distinction between these two is the entire engine of early Sufi practice.
It is a masterclass in introspective psychology. To understand states and stations, we first have to understand the prerequisite mujahadat, or spiritual struggles.
The grueling work.
Right. A seeker on this path, a murid, doesn't just sit in a dark room passively waiting for enlightenment to strike. They engage in brutal, systemic behavioral modification. Fasting for days, maintaining absolute silence, staying awake all night in prayer. These physical struggles act as a pressure cooker on the human psyche.
And when you put the psyche in a pressure cooker, things start to happen. The brain and the soul react. And the Sufis categorize these reactions with incredible precision. So let's look at the first category. Awal, the states.
A state is defined by its transient nature. It is a fleeting flash of profound emotion or spiritual insight. The defining characteristic of a state is that it is completely involuntary.
You can't control it.
No, it strikes the heart without warning, and it vanishes just as quickly. You cannot summon a state through willpower, and you cannot force a state to stay once it decides to leave.
The sources describe these states so vividly. It might be a sudden, overwhelming wave of joy where you feel entirely connected to the universe, or it could be the exact opposite. A profound, crushing sorrow, a feeling of deep contraction and unworthiness.
Or intense, paralyzing awe.
Yeah. They viewed these states as direct, unearned gifts from the divine, dropping into the consciousness to give the seeker a taste of what is possible.
But the early masters identified a massive psychological trap here. Human beings are biologically wired to chase highs.
Oh, 100%.
When a seeker experiences that intense, euphoric state of closeness to God, they get addicted to it. They want to live in that high permanently. But the Sufi psychologists understood that you cannot build a sustainable spiritual architecture on unpredictable emotional weather.
Because what happens when it rains?
Exactly. If your religion is based on feeling the high, what happens when the high fades? You collapse.
Right. You become a spiritual adrenaline junkie, constantly chasing the next emotional experience rather than doing the actual work. To solve this, they introduced the second, far more demanding category. Maqamat, the stations.
Well, hard work.
If a state is a fleeting gift, a station is a permanent, stable baseline of character that you have to earn through blood, sweat, and tears.
The mechanics of achieving a station are staggering in their rigor. The texts map out specific pipelines you must progress through. Let's examine the station of fear of God. This isn't just a subjective feeling of being scared. It is a highly structured, tiered behavioral program.
The breakdown of this is wild. To achieve the first baseline of the station of fear, a seeker must permanently and completely abandon all major sins. Murder, theft, adultery. Okay, that makes sense. That's the baseline of basic religious compliance.
Sure.
Once you master that, you graduate to the next tier. You must abandon all minor sins.
Which requires a terrifying level of self-surveillance. You are monitoring every word you speak to ensure no idle gossip slips out. You are monitoring where your eyes look. It is exhausting.
I can't even imagine.
But if you achieve that, you move to the third tier, abandoning the mushtabihat, the doubtful things.
The gray areas.
Yes. Things that aren't technically forbidden by the jurists in Kufa, but they aren't explicitly praised either. A Sufi in the station of fear abandons them completely just to be safe.
And then comes the final tier, which completely short-circuits normal human behavior. To fully realize and lock in the station of fear, the seeker has to begin cutting back on perfectly halal, 100% lawful, permitted things.
Mechanically, what they're doing is rewiring their dopamine receptors. They will eat significantly less food than is permitted, just enough to survive. They will sleep far less than is permitted. They will speak far less than is permitted.
Just absolute deprivation.
Why? Because they fear that indulging in even lawful physical pleasures will soften their heart and distract their focus from the divine reality.
It is a radical asceticism. And Ibn al-Qayyim gives us the exact formula for how the mind processes this journey. He says it all begins with a lawami, a flash or a gleam, like seeing a burst of lightning on the horizon. It's a tiny spark of an idea or a feeling.
Yeah.
If you focus on that spark, it might intensify into a how, a state. The lightning strikes you, you feel the intense emotion, but it will fade unless you apply the brutal systemic discipline of the mujahadat.
The struggles.
Right. If you work incredibly hard, you can anchor that fleeting feeling into your character permanently, turning it into a maqam, a station.
The cardinal rule of this psychological map is strict linear progression. You cannot cheat the system. A seeker is strictly forbidden from even looking toward a higher station, say the station of contentment, until they have flawlessly and permanently mastered every single parameter of their current station.
You can't skip levels.
It is a spiritual ladder where the rungs are made of iron.
I think the easiest way to understand the difference between states and stations is to look at physical fitness. Have you ever experienced a runner's high?
Occasionally, when I actually force myself to run.
Right. You're out for a jog, maybe you're usually struggling, but suddenly the endorphins hit. Your breathing syncs up perfectly, your legs feel weightless, and you feel like you could run a marathon without stopping. That is a state, a how. It's amazing, it's intoxicating, but you can't just press a button in your brain to make it happen. And no matter what you do, 3 miles later, it's gone. You're just a sweaty person breathing heavily again.
Exactly. The runner's high is the transient gift.
But the maqam, the station, that is the grueling, unglamorous training regimen. It's setting your alarm for 4:30 a.m. when it's freezing rain outside and going for a run anyway, even when you feel terrible.
Sounds awful.
It is. It's the strict diet. It's the stretching. By doing the daily, brutal work of the station, you physically alter your body's baseline. You build the cardiovascular capacity so that eventually running 5 miles isn't a struggle anymore. Your prominent baseline of existence has been elevated.
The stations are the brick and mortar foundation you build. The states are just the weather that occasionally rolls through.
That's a great way to put it.
It's a brilliant, highly structured way to manage the chaos of human emotion. But historically, whenever a movement builds a structure this powerful, they inevitably hit a ceiling. They master the internal ethics, they map the psychology, and then they ask, what next?
And this brings us to the most turbulent, whiplash-inducing pivot in our entire deep dive. Because as we trace the history forward a few centuries, the sources reveal that simply being a highly disciplined, ethical ascetic stopped being enough. Sufism underwent a massive mutation.
A huge mutation.
It stopped being merely a science of behaving correctly, and it aggressively morphed into a radical, incredibly controversial theory of knowing everything.
We are entering the era of esoteric philosophy. To understand how jarring this shift was, we have to look at epistemology. Epistemology is the philosophical study of knowledge. How do we know that what we know is actually true?
And the heavy hitter in this debate is Al-Ghazali, one of the most brilliant and influential scholars in Islamic history. Al-Ghazali lays out the stakes perfectly. He says, look, everyone agrees that the ultimate goal of human existence, the source of true happiness, is knowing God.
That's the given.
The controversy isn't the destination, the controversy is the vehicle you use to get there.
Al-Ghazali outlines the orthodox method. The theologians, the philosophers, the mainstream scholars, they use deduction. They rely on the intellect. They read massive volumes of text. They construct logical syllogisms. They debate premises and conclusions. It is a slow, methodical, intellectual climb up the mountain of truth, relying entirely on the human brain.
But the Sufis of this later era looked at the intellect and said the brain is a flawed instrument. The brain relies on the five senses, and the senses can be easily tricked.
Very easily.
If you rely on logic, you will inevitably make a calculation error. So they bypassed the brain entirely. They championed a concept called ilham, which means direct inspiration.
And ilham is not a gentle intuition. In the texts, it is described almost violently. It is knowledge that attacks the heart. It is a sudden, absolute, undeniable truth that is deposited directly into the human consciousness by an angelic presence.
It's a direct download.
Exactly. It completely bypasses the rational processing centers of the brain. It doesn't require deduction. It is instant apprehension of the truth.
It's the difference between trying to code a massive software program from scratch using trial and error versus just plugging a hardwire directly into the mainframe and downloading the entire completed file instantly. The Sufis claim they had the hardwire connection.
But there's a catch. The hardwire only works if the receiver is perfectly tuned. This is where their earlier psychological mapping of the stations becomes the prerequisite for this new philosophy.
The connection.
Yes. They argued that the human heart is like a mirror. If the mirror is covered in the dust of arrogance, the rust of worldly desires, and the cracks of sin, it cannot reflect anything. But if you use the brutal discipline of the ascetic stations to polish that mirror until it is flawlessly clean, the divine truth will simply reflect upon it automatically with zero error.
And because of this belief, the methodology of the movement shifted radically. They started telling their followers to stop reading books.
Put down the books.
Stop studying formal logical arguments. Why would you stare at a paper map when you can just open your eyes and look at the landscape? Just polish the mirror of your heart, sit in silence, and wait for the angel to drop the knowledge into you.
And this is where we have to acknowledge the absolute whiplash this caused in the broader society. Because once they claimed they were receiving direct downloads of flawless truth, they didn't just talk about being humble anymore. They started talking about the deep mechanics of the cosmos.
They waded into the deep end of metaphysics. Suddenly you have mystics claiming they know the exact layout of the spiritual universe. They were describing the precise architecture of the throne of God.
And hierarchies of angels.
Right. They claimed the ability to read the thoughts of the people around them or to predict future events. They even developed this elaborate cosmic political structure, claiming the universe is secretly ruled by a hidden hierarchy of saints, topped by a supreme spiritual leader known as the Quazo, the pole, who is energetically holding reality together.
They are essentially claiming access to the back-end source code of the universe. And as this philosophical shift intensified, it led to a phenomenon that deeply terrified the Orthodox establishment Shadahat.
Ecstatic utterances. These are the moments when the hardwire download overloads the human hardware.
Precisely. The Sufis argued that when a human heart is suddenly hit with the infinite, unfiltered reality of the divine, the human mind essentially short-circuits. It experiences a state of extreme spiritual intoxication.
It's too much to handle.
Yeah. And in that drunken state, the mystic loses all sense of their individual self and blurts out statements that, to a sober observer, sound like raging, blasphemous heresy.
The prime example of this in the sources is Abu Yazid al-Bistami. His Shadahat are legendary and shocking. While in a state of ecstasy, he didn't just praise God, he famously cried out, "Dress me in your Inus."
Which is an insane thing to say.
It is. He made claims of cosmic ascensions, saying he flew through the realm of eternity for tens of years, exploring the divine architecture, until he realized that even those visions were just an illusion masking the absolute, crushing oneness of God.
And as the centuries progressed, figures like the incredibly complex Andalusian mystic Ibn Arabi took these ecstatic visions and fused them with high philosophy.
Making it even more complicated.
Much more. He blended Sufi experiential mysticism with elements of Neoplatonic Greek thought. This idea that the physical world is just a gross emanation of higher, purer spiritual ideals. This synthesis is often referred to as illuminationism. It became an incredibly dense, highly intellectual framework that tried to logically explain the illogical experiences of the mystics.
I need to pause here because we really have to recognize how insane this all sounded to the mainstream theologians. Put yourself in the shoes of an Orthodox Ash'ari theologian in Baghdad.
Okay, let's play this out.
You've spent your entire life mastering Greek formal logic, meticulously studying the Quran, building careful, rational, unassailable proofs for the existence of God to defend the faith against skeptics. And then a guy who refuses to read books wanders into the courtyard and announces that he just downloaded the secrets of the universe directly from an angel.
Right.
And oh, by the way, he just spent the last decade flying through eternity in his mind.
The theologian's immediate reaction is, this is heresy. This destroys the finality of religion. If anyone can just claim a new direct download from God, the entire structure of the religion collapses.
Exactly. So how did they survive?
Hmm.
How did these mystics making these wild, universe-bending claims not get immediately exiled, imprisoned, or executed by the thousands?
It was a very precarious tightrope. Now, some of them were executed, famously Mansur al-Hallaj, who proclaimed, "I am the truth." But the movement largely survived by leaning heavily into that defense of spiritual intoxication.
The Shadahat defense.
Right. The mainstream Sufi leaders, who were trying to keep the peace, argued to the jurists. You cannot judge a man who is spiritually drunk using the legal codes of the sober world.
The insanity defense, essentially.
Sort of. They argued that these utterances weren't rational theological claims, they were involuntary poetry. It was the uncontrollable overflow of a finite human vessel that is too small for the infinite ocean being poured into it.
You don't execute a cup for overflowing.
Exactly. But even with that defense, the Orthodox scholars remain deeply, deeply suspicious of this entire enterprise.
Which naturally brings us to the most explosive consequence of claiming a direct connection to the divine backend. Miracles. Because the moment you claim to have transcended normal human limitations, people are going to ask you to bend physical reality.
And the miracle debate is a massive section of our sources. In Arabic terminology, a miracle performed by a prophet like Moses parting the sea is called a mujiza, which means something that incapacitates the opposition.
It's meant to stun you into belief.
Yes, but a miracle performed by a saint or a highly elevated mystic is called a karama, which simply means a grace or an honor. The theological war was over whether karamat were actually real.
The mainstream Sufis, and surprisingly the dominant rationalist theological school known as the Ash'aris, actually agree on this. They said, yes, saints absolutely can perform miracles. Water can flow from their hands, they can traverse vast distances in the blink of an eye, they can heal the sick.
They accepted it.
But to protect the structural integrity of the religion, they instituted a brilliant ironclad rule that separates a saint from a prophet.
This distinction is the linchpin that kept the theology from collapsing. According to the mainstream consensus, a prophet must publicly display their miracles. If Jesus is claiming to be a prophet to a skeptical crowd, he must heal the sick in front of them to prove his divine backing.
It's a public demonstration.
A prophet uses miracles as a tool for public persuasion and mass conversion.
But a saint is bound by the exact opposite rule. A saint must actively hide their miracles from the public.
Why? Because a saint isn't bringing a new message. They aren't trying to start a new religion or convince the masses of anything. For a saint, a miracle is a deeply private, internal mechanism.
It's just for them.
Right. The sources explain that saints experience miracles merely to calm their own personal psychological doubts. They use the scriptural example of the prophet Abraham. In the Quran, Abraham asks God to show him how he resurrects the dead. God asks, "Do you not believe?" And Abraham replies, "I do, but just to reassure my heart."
To settle the heart.
That is the function of a karma. It is a private reassurance to settle a turbulent heart.
In fact, the true Sufi masters were terrified of miracles. The sources point out that if a genuine mystic suddenly saw water flowing from a rock for them, their first reaction wasn't joy, it was immense fear.
They feared the concept of istidraj.
A divine trap.
Exactly. Istidraj is the idea that God might give you a supernatural ability specifically to test your ego, to see if you will become arrogant, think you are special, show off to your friends, and subsequently fall from your hard-earned spiritual station.
It's a test.
So the greatest saints viewed miracles as dangerous distractions from the true goal, which was simply knowing God.
But of course you had the hardline skeptics. The strict literalist scholars, most notably a brilliant Andalusian polymath named Ibn Hazm. We see his arguments heavily featured in the sources, and he absolutely rejects the idea of saintly miracles.
He was not a fan.
Not at all. Ibn Hazm was a man of extreme logical consistency. He argued that the laws of physics, gravity, the properties of water, the constraints of time and space are established by God. To break those laws is the ultimate cosmic disruption.
And he didn't think God would do that for just anyone.
Exactly. He argued that God only allows that disruption for prophets to establish a new era of human history. Allowing any random pious person in Baghdad to teleport or read minds breaks the logical consistency of reality. For Ibn Hazm, a saint's only miracle is having really good character.
But reading Ibn Hazm reveals something truly remarkable about this esoteric era. While he violently disagreed with the Sufis about teleportation and mind reading, his focus on the spiritual reality of the individual over the external societal rules led to a profound defense of a marginalized group.
Yes, this is huge.
The intense focus on the internal, hidden spiritual world opened the door to absolute equality for women.
This is one of the most powerful paradigm shifts in the entire tradition. The texts are incredibly explicit. There's absolutely zero theological disagreement in classical Islam that women can achieve the ultimate highest apex of sainthood and possess the exact same divine graces and miracles as men.
In the external world of fiqh and politics, women were often sidelined. They couldn't be the caliph, they couldn't lead the armies. But in the invisible, internal empire of Sufism, the playing field was ruthlessly level.
Totally equal.
Ibn Haytham, the strict literalist, fiercely defended the spiritual equality of women. He goes to the primary text and points out that God sent angels directly to converse with Mary, the mother of Jesus. God directly inspired the mother of Moses.
The precedent is there.
Ibn Hazm argued forcefully that anyone who claims a man is inherently spiritually superior to a woman like Mary or the Prophet's wife Aisha is not just wrong, they are bordering on outright heresy.
Because the body does not matter in the realm of the spirit. The gender of the vessel is irrelevant to the purity of the mirror. Which brings us to arguably the most important paradigm-shattering figure in our entire deep dive. If we are talking about changing the vocabulary of a religion, we have to talk about Rabia al-Adawiyya.
She is a monumental figure.
She's the absolute epitome of this female spiritual power, and she fundamentally revolutionized what Sufism was.
To understand the magnitude of her revolution, we have to understand her trauma and her socioeconomic reality. Rabia lived in the 8th century, dying around 801 AD. She was born into extreme poverty in Basra.
A tough life from the start.
Incredibly tough. According to historical accounts, she was orphaned at a young age, kidnapped, and sold into slavery. She spent her formative years as human property, subject to the absolute control of a master.
Awful.
She was eventually freed because her master was supposedly terrified by the intensity of her all-night prayers.
Keep that background in mind, A woman who knew exactly what it meant to be a slave, to be commanded by a master holding a whip. Because before Rabia entered the scene, what was the primary driving motivation of the early Sufi ascetics?
Terror. It was the station of fear that we dissected earlier. The early movement was driven by a mathematically precise, paralyzing fear of the fire of hell and a desperate, starving desire for the physical rewards of heaven.
It was a transaction.
It was a purely transactional theology.
Yeah.
You obey the master perfectly, you avoid the wick, and you get your wages in paradise. It was the theology of a servant trying to appease a terrifying king.
And Rabia, the former slave, looks at this entire transactional, fear-based system, and she shatters it. She introduces a concept that completely rewires the psychological landscape of mysticism. Pure, unadulterated divine love, the Arabic terms hub and ishku.
She looks at these men who are starving themselves in terror, and she famously declares that she absolutely refuses to worship God out of a fear of hellfire. And equally, she refuses to worship him out of a desire for the gardens of paradise.
Because, as she profoundly put it, doing that makes you a bad employee.
That analogy is so devastating. Think about it mechanically. If you are an employee who only shows up to work because you are terrified your boss will sue you, or you only do a good job because you are expecting a massive Christmas bonus, you don't actually care about the company.
You don't care about the work at all.
You don't care about the boss. You only care about your own comfort and your own bank account. Your obedience is fundamentally selfish.
Rabia argued that worshiping God just to get a mansion in heaven or to avoid burning in hell is a selfish transaction. You're just using God to get what you want. She said she loved God purely for who he is, independently of any reward or punishment.
But completely selfless love.
She has this heartbreakingly beautiful, incredibly bold line in her poetry, where she addresses God directly and asks, Would you burn a heart that loves you?
It changes the entire emotional frequency of the religion. She didn't invent a new legal ruling. She invented a new way to feel. She lived her life in a state of profound sorrow and perpetual weeping, but it wasn't the weeping of fear that defined the early men of Basra.
It was different.
It was the weeping of absolute longing. She missed her creator. She felt the pain of separation. She set the permanent template for the motif of the sorrowful, weeping lover seeking reunion with the beloved.
I really want the listener to internalize the scale of this shift. Rabia takes Sufism from a terrifying, mathematically strict asceticism, where you are neurotically counting your minor sins and terrified to eat a piece of bread, and transforms it into a deeply romantic, poetic, emotional pursuit of union.
Rabia al-Adawiyya is the reason Sufi poetry sounds the way it does today, period. When you log on to Instagram and read Rumi or you read Hafez, and they are using metaphors about being drunk on the wine of divine love or the agonizing ache of separation or the burning of the heart, that entire emotional lexicon was built by a freed slave woman in Basra who looked at a religion of fear and refused to be a bad employee.
It is an incredible, enduring legacy. And it brings us to the end of our deep dive today. We have covered a massive expanse of history and psychology. We started with a disorganized group of protesters in the booming metropolis of Basra who were literally just named after the scratchy wool shirts they wore to reject luxury.
We watched them build an intellectual empire, fighting a bitter civil war of ideas against the legal jurists of Kufa over whether the outward law of society or the inward truth of the heart mattered more.
We explored their exhausting, meticulously designed psychological map of the soul, the difference between the fleeting, involuntary states and the grueling, permanent stations. We saw them pivot into mind-bending esoteric philosophy, claiming direct, angelic downloads of knowledge and uttering ecstatic, dangerous truths that challenged the very fabric of orthodox theology.
And finally, we saw a woman, Rabia, who took all of that rigorous, terrifying architecture of fear and flooded it with the transforming power of divine love. It is a profound evolution from the outward physical rejection of the material world to the complete inward embrace of the divine presence.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. In our modern era, we are obsessed with gathering data. If we have a problem, our instinct is to consume more. We want to read another book, download another productivity app, listen to 100 hours of audio, constantly filling our brains with more information, convinced that if we just acquire enough data, we will finally figure out the truth of our lives.
Right. More is always better.
Exactly. But the Sufi concept of ilham, that direct angelic inspiration, and the brutal psychological training of the early mystics, argues the exact opposite. It argues that the ultimate transformative truth only enters your consciousness when you stop trying to stuff more information into it. It only arrives when you do the hard, quiet work of polishing the mirror of your heart, clearing away the ego, the distractions, and the noise. So I'll leave you with this to mull over. What if the answer to your deepest, most persistent questions isn't found by adding more data to the hard drive, but by finally clearing the dust off the glass?
You know, usually when we picture a religious mystic, there's this almost universal expectation of total serenity.
Right, yeah. Like they're completely untroubled.
Exactly. We imagine someone who's just completely detached, kind of, floating above the fray of daily life. You picture the whirling dervishes or that really generic soothing poetry you find printed on a coffee mug or a desk calendar.
Oh, absolutely. The calendar poetry.
Right. Just this aura of peaceful, unquestioning enlightenment.
It is a very, very sanitized image. I mean, it's comforting, right? We like our mystics to be ethereal.
We do.
We want them to be these uncomplicated figures who just, smile gently all the chaos of the world.
But then you step into the actual historical origins of Sufism, which is Islamic mysticism, and suddenly that peaceful coffee mug image just completely shatters.
Oh, it falls apart immediately.
Yeah. We're looking at a historical landscape that is just gritty, deeply controversial, and frankly, anything but uncomplicated.
I mean, it is the absolute definition of a theological and societal collision course.
Yeah.
When you actually dig into the sources, you weren't looking at passive meditators.
Not at all.
No. You were looking at a movement that triggered a massive empire-wide existential crisis.
Exactly. And that is exactly what we're getting into today. So welcome to the deep dive. We're taking a massive stack of historical and theological research, and we're parsing through all this dense academic material for you.
Pulling out the real story.
Right. We want to pull out the true origins, the evolution, and the staggering controversies of Sufism. Because, imagine you're living in this ancient, highly structured society, right?
Where every single outward action is governed by strict law.
Yes. And suddenly this group of people emerges who say that your perfect outward actions mean absolutely nothing if your inward conscience is dead.
Which was a terrifying concept for the establishment.
Yeah.
Truly terrifying.
Right, because it upends everything. So what we're going to explore today is how this localized rebellion of the conscience evolved from, just a group of harsh ascetics into a highly complex, fiercely debated metaphysical system.
It really is a story about that universal human tension. The tension between outward societal rules and uncompromising inward truth.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because before we can even begin to talk about what these early mystics actually believed or, how they nearly brought the system down, we have to establish exactly who we are talking about.
Yeah, the names matter.
They do. And that starts with a bit of a linguistic detective story. We really need to clear away the myths regarding where the very name Sufism comes from.
This is entirely necessary because the historical myths surrounding the name are, honestly, almost as famous as the movement itself. It's a classic case of retroactive branding.
Retroactive branding, I love that.
Well, I mean, think about it. As the movement grew over the centuries, it reached these lofty, incredibly complex spiritual heights. And people felt deeply uncomfortable with its humble origins.
They wanted a rebrand.
Exactly. They wanted a name, an etymology, that actually reflected their new intellectual and spiritual prestige. But the historical reality is stubbornly simple. The term Sufism, or tasawwuf in Arabic, comes strictly from the Arabic word for wool.
Which is sif.
Suf.
That's it.
Just wool.
That is literally it. It specifically refers to the coarse, ishy, undyed wool garments that were worn by the earliest ascetics of this movement.
Oh.
Yeah, it was a purely physical identifier. But over the centuries, people invented this massive laundry list of alternate, much more glamorous origin stories just to avoid the itchy sweater reality.
Okay, let's run through these myths, because the mental gymnastics people perform to avoid the word wool are just fascinating to me. First off, there's the incredibly popular claim that the name comes from al-Sufa.
Right, which translates to the people of the bench.
Yeah, and these were historical groups of poor ascetics who used to literally sit on a bench in the mosque in Medina right during the time of the Prophet Muhammad.
It sounds like the perfect spiritually pure origin story, doesn't it? It really does. You link your movement directly to the holiest figures sitting in the original mosque. It's great PR. But linguistically, the historical scholars say absolutely not. The root letters just don't support the derivation.
They don't fit.
Right. Then there's the theory that it comes from Saf, which means the first row of Muslims in congregational prayer.
Which, again, is a beautiful poetic metaphor.
Totally.
It implies that these mystics are spiritually at the absolute forefront of the faith, standing in the front row before God.
No.
But grammatically. It's factually incorrect. You simply cannot conjugate Saf to get Sufi.
And the list of rejected theories just keeps going. Scholars have had to point out that it does not come from the Sufa, which was an ancient Bedouin tribe.
Yep.
It does not come from a specific desert plant called Sufana.
Also no.
There was even this really strange theory that it came from a phrase referring to the hairs growing on the nape of the neck.
I mean, they were really reaching at that point.
They really were. But perhaps the most enduring misconception among early scholars was that it derived from the Arabic word for purity, which is safa.
Which is the one that makes the most thematic sense, right? If your entire life is dedicated to purifying your soul, of course you want to be called the purified one.
Exactly. It fits the brand perfectly.
But the grammatical reality is harsh. Trying to derive the word Sufi from Safa has been recognized as a linguistic impossibility since, the 8th century.
Wow, so they knew early on it was wrong.
Oh, absolutely. The vowels and the root structures simply do not align. They literally tried to force the grammar to make it fit, just because purity sounded vastly superior to coarse wool.
It really highlights how desperate both Eastern and Western scholars were to find a more, intellectual origin for the word. And that actually brings us to the massive Western theory that gets utterly dismantled in the research.
Yes, the Greek connection.
Right, the idea that Sufi comes from the Greek word sophos, meaning wisdom or theosophy.
This was a very, very popular theory in 19th century European scholarship. The basic assumption was that anything this philosophically complex in the Middle East must have been, a localized version of Greek philosophy.
Right, like they couldn't possibly have come up with it themselves.
Exactly. So they just assumed Sufi was an Arabized pronunciation of Sophos.
But then a brilliant philologist named Noldeck comes along and scientifically proves this Greek link is literally impossible.
Noldeck's proof is just a masterclass in linguistic forensics. He points out a very strict rule in historical translation. When Greek words were transliterated into Arabic during the great translation movements of that era, the Greek letter sigma was consistently, without exception, written as the Arabic letter sin.
Okay, so Sophos starts with a sigma, so it should start with a sin in Arabic.
Exactly. But the word Sufi is spelled with a completely different Arabic letter. It's spelled with a heavy, emphatic sad.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and in the rigorous world of historical linguistics, you do not just swap a sin for a sad arbitrarily. It just doesn't happen.
It's like arguing that the English word cat comes from a foreign word starting with Z. It just breaks the established rules of how those languages interacted.
Furthermore, Noldeck points out the missing bridge.
The intermediary language, right?
Right. For a Greek concept to enter the Arabic lexicon organically at that specific time, it almost always passed through an intermediary language, usually Aramaic or Syriac.
Okay.
And Noldeck showed that there is no intermediary Aramaic word for Sophos that could have evolved into the Arabic Sufi. The linguistic bridge simply does not exist.
So after all that philosophical reaching, we are right back to wool. This is exactly like trying to trace the origin of the word punk or goth for you today.
How do you mean?
Well, people today might invent these elaborate socio-political backstories about what it means to be a punk, that it's this profound rebellion against the socio-economic machine and anarchic philosophy of ultimate freedom. And maybe it became that, but originally in the 1970s, it was highly physical. It was about the aesthetic, the safety pins, the leather jackets, the mohawks. It was an immediate, visceral, outward rejection of the norm through clothing. Only later did people try to intellectualize it.
That is a highly accurate analogy. The wool was a physical identifier, a deliberate aesthetic provocation, long before it became the title of a complex philosophical system.
A provocation, I like that.
And we actually have the exact historical anchors for when this physical identifier transitioned into a formal title.
Right. The word Sufi was used as a singular title for the very first time in the second half of the 8th century, and the first guy to officially get this title was a man named Jabir ibn Hayyan.
Who is a fascinating figure.
Incredible resume. He was a Shiite alchemist from the city of Kufa.
Yeah, heavily involved in early chemistry, mysticism, and esoteric philosophy. And he adopted this specific, harsh approach to asceticism. Another very early figure given the title was Abu Hashim al-Kufi.
Notice they're both from Kufa.
Exactly. Then, the plural form of the word Sufia first pops up in the historical record a little bit later. Specifically, we see it in the year 814 AD, which is 199 AH in the Islamic calendar, during a rebellion in Alexandria.
And there's another early figure from Kufa worth mentioning, right? Abdak al-Sufi.
Yes, he died in Baghdad around 825 AD.
What's wild about Abdak is that he was a strict vegetarian, and politically he believed that religious leadership, or the imamate, had to be divinely appointed, not just chosen by the community.
Which really shows you how diverse these early individuals were. You have alchemists, vegetarians, political dissidents. So in these early days, the term Sufi was really just a localized, almost slang term in the city of Kufa to describe these eccentric ascetics in their itchy robes.
But it didn't stay local for long, did it?
No, within 50 years, Sufi became the blanket term for all the mystics operating in Iraq.
It became the dominant brand.
It really did. Contrasting with the mystics further east in Khorasan, who were called the Malamatiya.
Oh, right. The ones who actively sought out public blame and humiliation to crush their own egos.
Exactly. But if we connect this back to the bigger societal picture, the simple act of wearing this wool was deeply controversial from day one.
This is the part I really want to dig into. Why? It is literally just a rough piece of fabric from a sheep. Why did it upset the authorities so much?
Because in that cultural context, aesthetics carry immense theological weight. The critics targeted early ascetics, like a man named Farquad al-Sabaki, who was actually a student of the famous early theologian Hassan al-Basri.
Okay.
They condemned the wool garment because they viewed it as an imported foreign practice. Specifically, they saw it as a Christian aesthetic.
Ah, because Christian monks in the Syrian and Egyptian deserts had been wearing coarse hair shirts and wool for centuries as a sign of penance.
Precisely. The mainstream Islamic establishment looked at these Muslims putting on rough wool and said, "You are imitating the Christian monks. You are introducing a foreign innovation into our faith." This shows us that long before the complex theology of Sufism developed, long before they were writing dense poetry or philosophy, there was massive societal resistance just based on their aesthetic choices. They were seen as cultural infiltrators.
Which brings us perfectly to the next major historical question. If the mainstream establishment thought the wool was a Christian import, where did the actual ideas come from?
This is where we transition from the origins of the name to the geographic and cultural genesis of the movement itself.
Let's talk about the foreign import myth, because this has been a massive battlefield in the historical study of the movement.
It really has. For a long time, early Western scholars, men like Merckx and Jones, formulated these grand theories that Sufism was an entirely foreign import.
Right. Merckx argued fiercely that it was taken directly from Christian monasticism in the Levant, didn't he?
He did. And others argued it was borrowed wholesale from Greek Neoplatonism or Persian Zoroastrianism, or even that it was brought over from the Indian Vedas.
It's almost insulting to the early Sufis, right? The assumption was basically, well, these profound mystical ideas couldn't possibly have originated within Islam itself. They must have stolen them from the Greeks or the Indians.
That was the bias, yes. But the intensive historical research, heavily supported by scholars like R.A. Nicholson, pushes back incredibly hard against that narrative.
Nicholson's work is vital here.
It is. The research completely refutes the idea that Sufism was just copy-pasted from other religions. Instead, it proves that Sufism grew organically from within the Islamic community itself.
So what was the bedrock, if not Greek, philosophy?
The bedrock was the intense, obsessive, dedicated study and recitation of the Quran and the Hadith, the sayings and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad.
And the early term for this wasn't even Sufism, it was Tukaru.
Tukaru.
It literally meant drawing closer to God through rigorous, repetitive engagement with the scripture. It was born right in the heart of the community.
Exactly. It was an internal, organic development. Individuals were looking at their own holy texts and deciding to take the warnings about the afterlife and the commands to remember God to their absolute rigorous extremes.
But here is where it gets incredibly tense. Because if it was an organic, internal movement born directly from studying the scripture, why was the establishment so determined to crush it? And this leads us to one of the most shocking historical details in the research. There is a very famous Islamic saying, a hadith, that states bluntly, "No monasticism in Islam."
Yes. For centuries, this specific phrase was wielded as the ultimate, undeniable proof that the ascetic, isolated lifestyle of the early Sufis was fundamentally anti-Islamic.
But historians now say this hadith was likely fabricated.
This is a profound moment in understanding how religious authority and historical narratives operate. When historians rigorously analyze the chains of transmission, the lineage of who heard it from whom, for this specific hadith, the timelines and the narrators simply do not hold up to scrutiny.
So they just made it up.
The consensus is that this hadith was likely forged around the 3rd century of the Islamic calendar.
And they didn't forge it just for fun. They forged it with a highly specific political and theological purpose to suppress the rising Sufi movement.
They needed a silver bullet. The ascetics were gaining popularity, drawing people away from the rigid, state-sponsored legalism of the time.
Right.
To invalidate the movement, the establishment had to invalidate the scriptural foundation the movement was standing on. They forged the hadith to force a brand new interpretation of a very specific verse in the Quran Surah Al-Hadid, verse 27.
This is theological retconning at its finest. Because when you look at the historical records, earlier commentators from the first 3 centuries of Islam, highly respected figures like Mujahid and Abu Umama, had actually interpreted that specific Quranic verse as praising and permitting monasticism and deep asceticism.
They viewed the ascetic life as a valid, even noble pursuit of God. But as the Sufis grew in numbers and influence, they became a threat.
So the later establishment scholars, eventually championed by heavyweights like al-Zamakhshari, wielded this forged hadith to completely flip the interpretation of the Quranic verse,
turning it from a commendation of monasticism into a strict condemnation.
It's brilliant in a deeply cynical way. You can't just tell people to stop being mystics. You have to convince them that God never wanted them to be mystics in the first place.
Exactly.
But despite this massive, coordinated suppression, the movement was already taking deep root. And what's fascinating is how differently it grew depending on where it was planted.
Geography is destiny, even in theology.
It really is. The historical record lays out this fascinating geographic split in the early days. It is truly a tale of 2 cities, Basra and Kufa.
Right.
Let's look at Basra first. In Basra, the mystical movement was fostered largely by the Banu Tamim tribe. And the culture of Basra was very specific, it was pragmatic, it was orthodox. The people there were deeply critical and analytical.
Basra was a place that valued logic and grammar. It demanded harsh reality in its poetry, and it insisted on strict, uncompromising authenticity in the hadith. It was a no-nonsense environment.
And because of that cultural bedrock, the brand of asceticism that developed in Basra reflects that exact personality.
It does.
Led by monumental figures like Hassan al-Basri, who died in 728 AD, the mysticism of Basra was highly rational. It was grounded.
You could almost describe it as a clinical psychological approach to purifying the soul. Hassan al-Basri wasn't talking about flying through the cosmos or dissolving into light. He was talking about a constant sorrowful awareness of one's own sins and the terrifying majesty of God's judgment. It was austere and practical.
But then you travel up the river to the city of Kufa. Kufa was dominated by the Yamaniya tribes, and culturally they were the exact opposite of Basra.
The exact opposite.
The records show they were drawn to the imaginative. They loved the poetic, the anomalous, the strange. They were also heavily Shiite-leaning, which comes with its own rich, esoteric traditions regarding the imams.
And unsurprisingly, the mystical figures that emerged from Kufa are vastly different from the pragmatic Hassan al-Basri. We mentioned them earlier. Figures like the alchemist Jabir bin Hayyan or the vegetarian Abd al-Sufi.
Imagine being a strict vegetarian in an 8th century Arab tribal culture where slaughtering an animal and serving meat is the absolute pinnacle of hospitality and social integration.
It's unthinkable for most people at that time.
Yeah, Abdak refusing meat wasn't just a dietary choice. It was a radical, almost aggressive rejection of the dominant social fabric.
It perfectly illustrates the Kufan willingness to embrace the anomalous. I think it's vital to pause and consider how profoundly our local environment shapes our deepest philosophies.
Absolutely.
In one city, steeped in hard realities and logic, spirituality becomes a pragmatic, critical discipline. In another city, steeped in poetry, alchemy, and esoteric politics, spirituality becomes deeply imaginative, willing to challenge the fundamental physical structures of society.
It makes complete sense. You have these regional movements developing their own highly unique flavors of spirituality in isolation, but you can't stay in the provinces forever.
No, eventually they had to move.
Right. If a movement is going to matter, eventually it has to go to the capital.
And that is exactly what happened. The research notes that after the year 250 AH, the center of gravity for the Sufi movement shifted decisively to Baghdad.
Baghdad, the center of the world, the absolute heart of the Islamic Empire, filled with the greatest legal minds, the most powerful judges, and the most rigid Orthodox theologians.
Yes.
Once the Sufis set up shop in Baghdad, a massive explosive clash with the mainstream establishment was completely inevitable.
It was unavoidable because the core premises of the two groups were entirely fundamentally at odds. And it's important to clarify a point the research makes. The early Sufis did not march into Baghdad looking to start a theological war.
They didn't.
No, they actually desired isolation, poverty, and quiet reflection. The genesis of their movement was what historians call a rebellion of conscience.
Let's drill down into that. A rebellion against what, exactly?
It wasn't primarily a political rebellion against the tyranny of the caliphs or the outward injustices of society, although they certainly recognized those. It was far more intimate.
Okay.
It was a rebellion against one's own internal hypocrisy. The early Sufis were utterly terrified of the idea of performing all the correct religious rituals on the outside, praying perfectly, fasting exactly as prescribed, while remaining spiritually dead, arrogant, or corrupt on the inside.
And right there is the friction point. Because if you look at the Islamic jurists, the scholars, the powerful theologians who were running the society in Baghdad, their entire job, their entire worldview was based on judging people by their outward actions.
Precisely. The Sharia, the religious law, is an outward system. It governs what you do, how you conduct a business transaction, how you wash before prayer.
Right, visible actions.
Exactly. A judge in a court of law cannot measure your internal sincerity. He can only measure your compliance with the outward rule.
But the Sufis arrived in Baghdad and started saying, no, your compliance with the outward rule means absolutely nothing if your inward conscience is impure. They started prioritizing the invisible over the visible.
Imagine you are a powerful jurist. Your entire authority rests on your mastery of the complex legal codes. And suddenly, a mystic in a coarse wool robe tells the masses that your massive legal textbooks are secondary or even useless without a pure heart.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The jurists saw this not just as a theological error, but as a direct existential threat to the entire social and legal order. If people started prioritizing their own inward intuition over the outward law, the whole system of societal governance could collapse into anarchy.
So the establishment absolutely lost their minds. The historical record breaks down this theological dogpile, and it is brutal. It seems like literally everybody took a swing at them.
It was a multi-front war. First, you had the Kharijites attacking them. Then the Shiites, specifically the Imamiyya faction, turned on them fiercely.
Which is interesting given the early Kufan connection, right? Why did the Shiite establishment hate them?
Because of the concept of access to the divine. The Sufis believed that any individual, through rigorous purification, could seek direct personal access to God. They didn't feel they needed an intermediary.
Oh.
To the Imamiyya Shiites, this was deeply subversive because their theology centered on the absolute necessity of the 12 Imams as the unique divine guides for humanity.
So the Sufis were bypassing the Imams.
Exactly. Furthermore, the Sufis were very open and vocal about their ecstatic experiences, which directly violated the Shiite practice of taqiyya.
Right. Taqiyya is the practice of religious concealment or dissimulation in times of danger. If you are a persecuted minority, you hide your true beliefs to survive.
Yeah.
But the Sufis were out in the streets weeping and shouting about divine love. They were terrible at laying low.
They were the opposite of laying low.
Yeah.
Then the Sunni factions joined the attack. Groups like the Hashwiyya and the strict followers of Ahmad ibn Hanbal argued that Sufism was incredibly dangerous because all this internal meditation and focus on divine love was distracting average Muslims from their required outward worship. They argued it bred laziness and neglect of obligatory duties.
Basically saying you're just staring at your navel instead of doing your chores.
Pretty much.
And it gets worse. You had extreme Sunni scholars, people like Kashis and Abu Zura, who didn't just criticize them, they literally categorized the Sufis as zindiqs, which means heretics.
And that is a label that can carry the death penalty.
Right. And then the intellectuals joined in. The Mutazilites and the Zahirites attacked them from a purely philosophical angle regarding this concept of divine love.
This is a crucial philosophical debate. The Orthodox theologians, particularly the Mutazilites, rejected the Sufi concept of divine love because they felt it was inappropriate anthropomorphism.
Let's break that down because anthropomorphism is a big word. It means attributing human characteristics to a non-human entity, right?
Yes. In traditional Islamic theology, God is entirely transcendent. God is beyond human comprehension, beyond time, beyond space, and certainly beyond human emotion.
Okay.
To say that a human being could love God in a passionate, intimate way, or worse, that God could love a human back with that same intimacy, implied that God was somehow human-like.
It brings God down to our level.
Exactly. To the strict theologians, love requires a physical affinity, a similarity between two things. Therefore, to claim mutual love between a human and the divine implied physical touch or even incarnation.
Which was absolute unmitigated blasphemy.
Absolutely.
So if we look at this whole picture, the establishment isn't just annoyed by these guys in itchy sweaters, they are terrified.
They were.
It really sounds like the Sufis were democratizing spirituality. They were essentially telling the average person for you, you don't need a massive legal textbook, you don't need to memorize thousands of rulings, and you don't even need the jurists to reach God. You just need a pure heart.
That is a very astute way to look at it. They were bypassing the gatekeepers.
And history shows us that gatekeepers do not surrender their keys quietly.
No, they reacted with the full, terrifying force of the state law. The historical texts note that famous Sufis were arrested, chained, and dragged before the judges in Baghdad for trials.
Just for meditating and talking about love.
For what that love implied about the law, Dul-Nin al-Misri was put on trial, and 240 AH al-Nuri Abu Hamza all faced the wrath of the courts. And most famously, the mystic al-Halash, who was publicly tortured and executed for his ecstatic claims.
It was a bloodbath. But here we are centuries later, and Sufism is a massive global phenomenon. How did they survive this coordinated, multi-front war of annihilation?
They survived through brilliant strategic adaptation and synthesis. The research highlights that moderate Sufis eventually managed to bridge the terrifying gap between the inward conscience and the outward law.
Okay, how?
Well, the most monumental figure in this survival effort is al-Ghazali.
Al-Ghazali is a heavyweight.
He is arguably one of the most important figures in Islamic history. He managed to take the profound, inward spiritual focus of Sufism and weave it seamlessly together with orthodox Islamic ethics and Sharia law. He essentially proved to the hostile mainstream establishment that you can be a profound mystic, deeply concerned with the heart, and still perfectly rigorously follow the outward law.
So he made it safe.
Yes. The Orthodox jurists respected al-Ghazali immensely, and his work provided a protective shield for moderate Sufism.
But the peace treaty didn't cover everyone, did it? And it certainly didn't last forever. Even though al-Ghazali smoothed things over for the moderates, the historical record points out that later hardline jurists, specifically a very famous, uncompromising scholar named Ibn Taymiyyah, would eventually unleash their absolute wrath on the later, more radical Sufi philosophers.
Which brings us to the next and perhaps most complex phase of our historical deep dive.
If al-Ghazali made it safe, what were these later radical ideas that triggered scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah so fiercely?
To understand that, we have to look at how the Sufis attempted to describe the ultimate, final goal of their spiritual journey.
We are transitioning now from the societal clashes in the streets of Baghdad into the realm of deep, mind-bending metaphysics. Because early Sufism, as we've discussed, was relatively straightforward.
It was an ascetic discipline.
Right. The texts mention early Sufis progressing through stations, roughly 12 stations, like a ladder. You start with repentance, you move to patience, you achieve tawakkul, which means absolute, unwavering reliance on God. It was a rigorous, personal, moral journey.
But human psychology is complex. As the movement matured and these individuals spent decades in intense, isolated meditation and fasting, they began experiencing profound, overwhelming psychological and spiritual states.
Like altered states of consciousness.
Yes. They experienced moments where they felt completely detached from their physical bodies, moments where their own ego, their sense of I, seemed to entirely vanish, and they felt utterly consumed by the presence of the divine.
And they called this
ultimate, indescribable goal, union.
But here is the fundamental problem. How do you describe the indescribable? They didn't have a specialized vocabulary for these altered states.
No, they didn't.
So the research explains they had to borrow terms from the existing Islamic legal and theological systems and brutally twist their meanings to fit these new mystical experiences.
It was a massive linguistic gamble.
Yeah.
For example, they took the legal and physical word fana, which generally means annihilation, destruction, or passing away.
Okay.
And they repurposed it to describe the psychological annihilation of the ego, the losing of the self in the overwhelming divine presence.
But you can see exactly where the danger lies, right? When you start using inadequate, earthly, physical language to describe the profound, abstract experience of feeling united with God, people on the outside, people who haven't felt it, are going to misunderstand you catastrophically.
Misunderstand and condemn. When an ecstatic mystic stumbles out of isolation and says, I have lost myself and only God remains, or I am the truth, an Orthodox jurist doesn't hear a metaphor about the ego.
What do they hear?
The jurist hears, I am claiming that God has literally entered my physical body. This led to severe, deadly accusations of incarnation, the idea that God was living inside a human, which, again, is the ultimate heresy.
And just when the language barrier was causing enough trouble and getting people executed, history throws a massive, civilization-altering curveball into the mix.
The Greeks?
Yes. The historical texts note that by the 4th century AH, Greek philosophy floods into the Islamic world.
It was an intellectual tsunami. Through massive translation movements, the Islamic world suddenly had access to the works of Aristotle, the dialogues of Plato, the complex emanations of Plotinus, and the entire framework of Neoplatonism.
And the Sufis, who have been struggling for a century to find better words to describe their experiences of union, looked at this Greek philosophy and absolutely devoured it.
They really did. They absorbed these complex metaphysical concepts to explain what was happening in their souls.
This changes everything. This is the moment Sufism elevates from a movement of simple moral asceticism, guys in itchy wool trying not to sin, into a highly sophisticated, deeply complex philosophical system.
The historical research synthesizes this massive Greek-influenced era by outlining 3 distinct philosophical paths that Sufis developed to explain exactly how this union with God actually worked mechanically.
Okay, let's go through these 3 paths carefully, because this is where the theology gets incredibly dense, but it's vital for understanding the whole picture.
Let's start with the first path, which is called Ijtihadiyya. This approach was championed by brilliant early thinkers like Ibn Masara and al-Farabi. This path relies heavily on the Greek concept of the active intellect.
The active intellect, how does that work?
Think of it like a cosmic mechanism. They believed God doesn't interact directly with the messy physical world. Instead, God emanates a pure, divine, cosmic intellect.
Yeah.
In this path, the human soul is seen as passive. Union occurs when the passive human soul is acted upon, influenced, and ultimately pulled up by this divine active intellect.
Okay, I think I get it. It's almost like gravity or a magnetic field.
Yes.
The human soul is a piece of iron, and the active intellect is a massive magnet.
Yeah.
Union isn't the iron becoming the magnet, it's the iron being irresistibly pulled into alignment by that cosmic force.
That's a highly functional analogy. It explains the mechanics of the pull without requiring physical incarnation. So that is emanation.
Emanation. Got it.
The second path is called Ishraqiya, or illuminationism. This is famously associated with the philosopher Suhrawardi. This path discards the magnetism analogy and focuses entirely on the physics of light.
Illumination, so like shining a light in a dark room.
More profound than that, they believe that the actual foundational substance of the human soul could be illuminated, literally lit up and transformed by the divine light radiating from God. It is a very visual, radiant metaphysics.
I see.
Union here is the moment the soul ceases to be opaque and becomes perfectly transparent to the divine light.
That is beautiful. It's like a piece of glass catching the sun. The glass isn't the sun, but it is filled entirely with the sun's light.
It's exactly.
Well, emanation and illumination. What is the third path?
The third path is Wusuliya, and it was championed by the famous philosopher Ibn Sina, who is known in the Western world as Avicenna. This path is less about merging substances or catching light, and more about achieving absolute harmony.
Harmony like music.
Exactly like music.
Ibn Sina posited that the soul reaches a state of absolute conformity and harmony with the ultimate truth. Imagine the universe has a fundamental, perfect frequency.
Yak.
The human soul is an instrument that is out of tune. Through rigorous philosophy and mysticism, you tune the soul. Union is the moment your soul vibrates at the exact same frequency as the divine truth.
Wow.
In that state, the soul perceives an all-encompassing existence where there is no multiplicity, no division, just a profound unity of purpose and being.
So we had the magnet of emanation, the light of illumination, and the tuning fork of harmony. Those are three incredibly sophisticated ways to explain a mystical experience without getting executed for heresy.
They were very careful. But the research says these three paths were just the warm-up. They were just setting the stage for the ultimate philosophical controversy. The 13th century mic drop. We have to talk about Ibn Arabi and the formulation of Wadat al-Wujud.
This is the massive turning point in the history of Islamic mysticism.
Yeah.
Wadat al-Wujud translates literally to the unity of existence, or essentially pantheism.
Right.
Ibn Arabi looked at all these preceding ideas, the magnetism, the light, the harmony, and he pushed them past their safe boundaries, straight to their absolute logical extreme.
The radical idea here is hard to overstate. Ibn Arabi argued that the creator and the creation are not just intimately connected. They aren't just communicating or resonating in harmony.
Yeah.
He argued that they are fundamentally the exact same existence.
He erased the line entirely.
Right. He claimed there is literally only one existence in the entire universe, and that is God. Everything else, you, me, the stars, the trees, the microphone in front of me, we do not possess our own independent existence.
We are just manifestations.
Yes. We are just different manifestations, different ripples on the surface of that one single infinite ocean of divine existence.
Now remember Ibn Taymiyyah, the hardline jurist we mentioned earlier.
Oh yeah, the guy who unleashed his absolute wrath.
He recognized exactly what Ibn Arabi was doing, and he attacked this philosophy with unprecedented ferocity. Ibn Taymiyyah saw that if you accept Wadat al-Wujud, if the existence of the creatures is the exact same as the existence of the creator, then the boundary between the divine and the mundane is completely destroyed.
And if that boundary is destroyed, the entire basis of religious law, of right and wrong, of heaven and hell, collapses.
Exactly, because how can God punish a sinner if the sinner is just a manifestation of God?
But instead of backing down, the Sufis doubled down. The research gives us this shocking conclusion to the evolution of this idea. By the late 17th century, scholars like Al-Qurani and Al-Nabulsi took Wadat al-Wujud to a place that absolutely enraged the Orthodox Sunnis.
They really poked the bear.
They started messing with the most sacred phrase in Islam.
They reinterpreted the Shahada, the central declaration of the Islamic faith. There is no God but God.
Right.
The orthodox mainstream interpretation of this phrase is that it proves God's absolute uniqueness, independence, and separation from creation. He is the only God distinct from the world.
But these late Sufi philosophers argued the exact opposite.
Yes, they argued that there is no God but God actually means God is the only thing that fundamentally exists.
Wow.
Therefore, the physical world isn't something separate from God. It is just a mirror a manifestation to be worshipped within.
And the philosophical implications of this are absolutely wild. I really want you to grasp the gravity of this. If God is the only thing that exists and every single thing that happens is just an expression of that singular existence, then what about sin?
Right.
What about horrific evil? What about ultimate rebellion?
You have hit on the exact theological crisis. The texts point out that this philosophy led to highly controversial, deeply uncomfortable stances. Some Sufis, like Al-Jili, and even Ibn Arabi himself in certain readings, claim that the ultimate villains of religious history possessed a twisted, profound form of spiritual chivalry.
They are talking about the Pharaoh of Egypt, the ultimate tyrant who claimed to be a god, and Iblis Satan himself.
It is a staggering philosophical leap that infuriated the establishment. Their argument was this: because God's existence and will are total and all-encompassing, nothing can happen outside of it.
Okay.
Therefore, even the absolute defiance of Iblis or the supreme arrogance of Pharaoh was, on a terrifying cosmic level, just a manifestation of God's overarching design.
They viewed the divine will as so supreme that even rebellion against God's own religious law was still, in a metaphysical sense, an expression of the divine reality playing itself out.
They argued that Iblis refused to bow to Adam because he was a radical monotheist who refused to bow to anything other than God, even when God commanded him to.
That is just. It completely subverts the traditional understanding of good and evil, turning it into a complex play of divine manifestation.
It does.
You can completely see why the Orthodox jurists wanted to pull their hair out. If you run a society based on strict laws, and a mystic starts telling people that even the devil has spiritual chivalry, because his rebellion is part of the divine oneness, the entire legal, moral, and criminal framework of your society just dissolves into chaos.
Which brings up the most crucial historical question of survival. How did incredibly dense, borderline heretical metaphysical concepts like Wadat al-Wujud and the justification of Iblis survive the wrath of the state authorities?
And furthermore, how did these complex Aristotelian concepts reach everyday, common people who couldn't read Greek philosophy?
That is the genius of what they did next.
Right. We have seen how dangerous these ideas were. Now we need to look at how they built armor around them. Because the Sufis had a massive PR problem.
They really did.
They needed historical legitimacy to survive the courts, and they needed a way to translate high philosophy into something the average person could feel. So what did they do? The research explains they created something called an isnad.
An isnad is a very specific Islamic concept. It is a chain of transmission. In Orthodox Islam, if you want to prove that a hadith, a saying of the Prophet, is authentic, you must provide an unbroken chain of reliable narrators tracing it all the way back.
I heard it from X, who heard it from Y.
Exactly. Who heard it from the Prophet. It is the gold standard of historical proof.
And the Sufis, needing to prove they weren't just making things up, adopted this exact same structure, but instead of transmitting legal rulings, they used it for their mystical teachings.
They created elaborate chains linking their spiritual teachers generation by generation all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad himself, and very often through his cousin Ali.
It was an attempt to say, we aren't Greek innovators. We are the true inheritors of the Prophet's secret internal knowledge.
But here is the massive historical plot twist that I love.
Oh, this is the best part. The rigorous historians of the time, heavyweights like Ibn al-Jawzi and al-Dahabi, looked at these Sufi chains of transmission. They did the historical detective work. And they proved that the first 4 generations of these Sufi isnads were completely fabricated.
The historians looked at the timelines and the birth dates, and they realized the math didn't work. The chains claimed that student A learned from teacher B, but the historians proved that teacher B died 20 years before student A was even born.
Oops.
Yeah, the physical transmission was chronologically impossible.
So they just made it up.
Yes, but we have to understand why. It was a necessary protective fiction. The Sufis were trying to survive within a society that valued historical continuity and apostolic succession above absolutely everything else.
To survive, they had to retroactively construct a lineage.
Exactly. It gave them a shield of historical legitimacy, a protective cover even if the strict historians knew the links didn't actually connect.
And it wasn't just earthly, historical institutions they built to protect themselves. They developed an entire wild cosmic hierarchy. This is where the theology gets almost sci-fi.
It really does.
The texts detail this deeply held belief that the physical world is literally kept intact, kept from collapsing into nothingness by a hidden, invisible government of saints.
The structure they developed is incredibly specific and bureaucratic. They believe there are 300 Nuqaba, who are the leaders. Below them, 40 Abdal, or substitute.
Okay.
Then 7 umana, the trustees. 4 umad, the pillars. And at the very top of this invisible pyramid, one supreme Quatwab or Nugathi axis, the pole around which the spiritual universe revolves.
It is literally a spiritual shadow government. But how did they believe this actually worked? What was the mechanism?
They believed these individuals were so spiritually advanced, so perfectly aligned with the divine will, that their mere presence on Earth channeled the divine mercy that keeps the physical universe functioning.
If they leave.
If this hidden hierarchy were to vanish, the world would literally end. And the beauty of it, politically, is that these saints were hidden. The beggar on the street could secretly be one of the 40 Abdal.
Which forces you to treat everyone with immense respect, just in case.
Exactly.
And amidst all this rigid structure, the chains of transmission, the highly organized invisible government, you also had the absolute unpredictable chaos of the Majhub.
The Majtub is one of the most fascinating psychological phenomena in the history of religion.
The texts talk about the rukas, which were extreme behavioral licenses or freedoms taken by certain Sufis. These individuals were known as the fools of God.
A Majtub is someone whose mind has been completely shattered or overwhelmed by the intense experience of divine presence. Because they were seen as being entirely consumed by God operating on a higher, incomprehensible spiritual plane, society gave them a pass.
They were basically immune to the law.
Exactly. They might act wildly outside of societal norms, they might be chaotic, they might be offensive, they might openly break the strict religious laws in the marketplace.
But the cops wouldn't arrest them.
The Orthodox judges wouldn't touch them. They were exempt from the rules that governed everyone else because their madness was viewed as sacred.
So you have invisible cosmic governments, you have fools of God screaming in the streets, you have dense Aristotelian philosophy. But how did the actual feeling of Sufism reach the masses? Because you can't build a global movement on philosophy alone.
No, you need art.
Right. That brings us to their most famous export, the thing that survived right up to the modern day, the thing on the coffee mugs, Sufi poetry.
The historical texts mention the absolute giants of this art form.
Yeah.
Rumi, Hafiz, Ibn al-Farid, Jami. But what is critical for us to understand is why the poetry sounds the way it does.
Right. Because if you just pick up a book of Hafiz and read it literally, it sounds like a bunch of guys getting heavily intoxicated in a tavern.
It really does.
They constantly talk about wine, drunkenness, the scent of the tavern, and the beautiful cupbearer pouring the drinks, the sake. But the research explains this is an entirely intensely coded language.
It is a profound use of metaphor. Remember, they are living in a strict Islamic society where alcohol is absolutely fundamentally forbidden.
Right.
So they deliberately use metaphors of forbidden worldly intoxication to describe the overwhelming, intoxicating power of divine love.
But why use forbidden imagery?
Because the spiritual experience they were trying to describe, that total loss of ego, that overwhelming union with God, was considered dangerous and reserved only for the spiritual elite. They couldn't explain the dense metaphysics of Wadat al-Wujud to the average person in the street.
So they made them feel it instead.
Exactly. They could make them feel the disorientation and the ecstasy of it through the imagery of getting drunk. The wine is the divine love. The tavern is the gathering place of the mystics. And the cupbearer, the sake, is the spiritual guide, or God himself, pouring that love into the soul.
The research notes that this poetry wasn't just meant to be read quietly in a study. It was meant to be recited in gatherings to induce actual ecstasy, sometimes literally causing listeners to lose physical control, to weep, to enter trance states.
It was a full-body experience.
Have you ever heard a piece of music or read a poem that completely bypassed your logical brain, where you didn't have to analyze the chords or the meter, it just hit you in the chest and made you feel something profound and unexplainable?
That is precisely the psychological technology these Sufi poets were deploying.
A technology of the heart.
Yes, they were using the aesthetics of forbidden earthly pleasure to bypass the rigid, rational theology of the mind, circumventing the jurist's laws and striking directly at the human heart. They were inducing a state of spiritual intoxication that proved their philosophy without needing a single logical argument.
Which brings us incredibly to the end of our journey today. Let's summarize what we have covered, because we have traveled an immense distance.
We really have.
We started with a linguistic myth, proving that Sufism wasn't some imported Greek philosophy of wisdom, but literally just a physical description of the ishy, coarse wool garments worn by early ascetics in Kufa.
We traced how this organic internal movement grew from the rigorous recitation of scripture and survived deliberate, coordinated suppression. including the forging of hadiths by the establishment.
We watched as local tribal mentalities, the pragmatism of Basra and the imagination of Kufa, shaped the movement's early personality.
We saw them move to Baghdad and crash headlong into the Orthodox establishment.
We watched the Sufis get attacked by Kharijites, Shiites, and Sunnis because their focus on the inward conscience fundamentally threatened the authority of an outward rule-based society.
We followed their philosophical evolution, watching them absorb complex Greek thought, emanation, illumination, harmony, to try and explain the unexplainable feeling of union with God.
We explored the radical extremes of Ibn Arabi's Wadat al-Wujud, where God is the only existing reality, leading to those incredible controversies about the spiritual nature of Satan's defiance.
And finally, we saw how they institutionalized themselves to survive, fabricating historical lineages, building invisible cosmic hierarchies, allowing the wild freedom of the sacred madmen, and ultimately unleashing the intoxicating power of poetry that is still read all over the world today.
It is an unbelievable story of how a quiet rebellion of the conscience became a metaphysical empire of the soul.
It leaves us with a profound historical mirror. The research repeatedly points out that the early Sufis were driven by a terror of their own internal hypocrisy.
Right.
They lived in a society that only judged outward actions, and they rebelled fiercely against that superficiality.
And that leads us to our final thought for you to mull over. We live in a modern world that is increasingly obsessed with outward metrics.
We do.
We live so much of our lives outwardly on digital display. We are constantly judged by external validations, likes, followers, public opinion. We operate under a kind of digital sharia of social media where outward performance is everything.
Performance is key.
But in perfecting that outward performance, have we lost the vocabulary for our inner conscience? If a modern rebellion of the inner self were to happen today, a movement dedicated entirely to authentic, unvarnished internal truth against the crushing pressure of outward society, what wool would we wear?
A fascinating question to carry with us. The tension between the outward rule and the inward truth never really goes away.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives, keep looking for the gritty history behind the sanitized myths, and we will see you next time. What if the very things you are, most proud of, like your generosity, your tireless work ethic, or even your absolute moral certainty, what if those things are actually the exact weapons your own ego is using to destroy you?
I mean, it is a profoundly unsettling thought. We just operate under this assumption that our internal compass is naturally oriented toward true north.
Yeah, we assume if we're doing good things, we must be operating from a place of goodness.
Exactly. But when you actually start mapping the architecture of human intention, that assumption just falls apart very quickly.
And we cling to that illusion of precision, don't we? Because
Right.
usually when we look for a diagnosis, we expect clean lines.
Oh, absolutely.
Like if you fracture a bone, the x-ray shows a jagged white line, the doctor points to it, says, there is the problem.
It's visible. It's binary.
Right. Broken or not broken.
We really crave that kind of neat categorization in every aspect of our lives. But the moment you step into the realm of human psychology,
It gets messy.
extremely messy. When you try to diagnose your own hidden motivations and internal saboteurs, that X-ray machine becomes entirely useless.
Because you're stepping into an internal diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky.
Yes, and the fundamental problem is that when we try to analyze our own flaws, the tool we are using to look inward,
Our own mind.
right, our own mind, it is often the very thing actively deceiving us.
It's the ultimate conflict of interest. I mean, your ego is ordering itself and magically finding that it has done nothing wrong.
A miraculously perfect record.
Which brings us directly to the mission of today's deep dive. We are spending our time today decoding excerpts from a staggeringly detailed text on Islamic spiritual psychology.
It's a fascinating piece of work.
It really is. It's called Al-Arbi'in fi Marifat in Nafs wa Taskiyatiha, which translates to 40 hadiths on the knowledge and purification of the self. Right. And what's truly vital for us to understand about this source material is that we cannot just box it in as a purely theological manuscript.
No, not at all. What Dr. Saifi has compiled here operates as a highly sophisticated, timeless psychological manual.
Yeah, he's synthesizing a lot of different elements here.
He is. He's bringing together Quranic verses, prophetic traditions, which are the hadiths and centuries of deeply nuanced Sufi wisdom.
To answer a question that basically plagues all of us, right?
Exactly. Why do human beings so consistently act against our own best interests?
It's the million-dollar question.
And more importantly, how do we stop merely treating the symptoms of our dissatisfaction and actually repair the root cause?
So for you listening right now, whether you're trying to understand your own behavioral loops or, maybe you're prepping for a leadership role,
Or just fascinated by the mechanics of the human mind?
yeah, just be prepared to reevaluate your internal operating system. We are going to deconstruct what is truly controlling your daily decisions.
Because the central character of this entire framework, the root of that internal deception we just talked about, is a concept called the Nafs.
The Nafs. It's a term that feels intuitively familiar if you've studied this, but it's layered with surprising complexity.
It really is. If we look at the linguistic and textual breakdown provided in the source, the root word for nafs appears 295 times across 280 different verses in the Quran alone.
Wow, that is a massive footprint.
It is. And it's not a monolithic concept. Depending on the grammatical context, nafs can refer to the soul, the heart, the conscience, or the totality of a person.
But the linguistic history goes even deeper, doesn't it?
Yes. In classical Arabic linguistics, it was even used to denote blood or an overwhelming, insatiable desire.
I want to pause on that linguistic connection because it is so fascinating, tying the word for the self to the word for blood and desire.
It's very revealing.
Right, because blood is the biological mechanism that keeps the physical body alive. It pumps constantly without us even thinking about it.
And desire is the psychological mechanism that keeps us moving, striving, consuming.
Exactly. They're both vital, but if either of them spikes out of control, you're in critical danger.
That is an excellent way to frame it. And it aligns perfectly with the specific working definition the author establishes for our psychological analysis.
Which is what, exactly?
The text explicitly defines the nafs as the essence of life. It is a completely unique entity that is generated at the exact moment the divine, immaculate soul is tethered to the dense physical human body.
So it's like a byproduct of that fusion.
Yes, it
Yeah.
is the psychological friction between our spiritual origins and our biological reality.
The text uses an analogy here that really crystallized this for me. Let's imagine the creation of a human being is like the manufacturing of a car.
A very helpful modern equivalent.
Right. So the physical body, the bones, the flesh, the neural pathways, that is the mechanical chassis and the wiring.
And then you have the soul, the divine spark, which acts as the battery.
Exactly. But the nafs is the actual engine running of the car.
Yes.
It is the combustion chamber where the spark meets the fuel.
I appreciate that analogy because it highlights a crucial warning that the text is adamant about. The nafs is not inherently evil.
Which goes against a lot of what we hear today.
Hmm.
We have this pervasive tendency, especially in modern spiritual circles or extreme self-help movements, to talk about killing the ego.
Right. Destroying the self.
Yeah, the ego is always framed as the ultimate villain that needs to be eradicated if you want to reach enlightenment.
Yet this text forcefully pushes back against that mindset. It actually cites a specific prophetic tradition where the Prophet Muhammad forbids individuals from cursing their own nafs.
Wait, really? Forbids it?
Yes, he instructs them not to say, "My soul has become evil," or "My soul has become malicious."
So what are you supposed to say when you mess up?
The correct framing is, "My soul has become sluggish," or "My soul is lazy."
Oh, that's entirely different.
You do not take a sledgehammer to the engine of your car just because the car is driving toward a cliff.
Right, because the engine is simply doing what it was built to do. It's generating power.
Exactly. The nafs is the core of your intellect, your drive, your character. The entity being judged is the self.
So the problem isn't the engine. The problem is that there is an untrained, asleep driver at the steering wheel.
Letting the engine run entirely on its basest impulses.
Okay, so if the nafs is this engine, it fundamentally operates on desires. But the source material makes a really sharp distinction here between human beings and the rest of the animal kingdom.
Human beings and jinn, yes.
Yeah.
The unseen beings in Islamic theology.
Right. And I'm trying to wrap my head around why our internal engine operates so differently from, say, a predator in the wild.
The defining metric here is insatiability.
Insatiability.
The text acknowledges that animals absolutely possess raw biological needs. They experience hunger, thirst, the instinct for self-preservation, the drive to reproduce.
Sure, basic survival stuff.
However, an animal's biological programming includes a natural, built-in shut-off valve.
Meaning they know when to stop.
Precisely. When a lion consumes enough calories to satisfy its biological deficit, it stops hunting. The need is met, and the corresponding desire evaporates completely.
Right. A lion doesn't gorge itself on a zebra and then immediately start stressing about whether it has enough zebras stored away for a hypothetical famine next year.
No, it just goes to sleep in the sun.
It just sleeps. But humans possess a nafs.
And the unique function of the Nafs is that it takes those finite biological needs and mutates them into infinite, abstract desires.
We don't just consume food for caloric energy to survive the day.
No, we develop an obsession with culinary aesthetics. We crave the exclusivity of a difficult-to-book restaurant.
Yeah, we attach our social status to the vintage of wine we order or whatever.
Exactly. We don't just seek shelter from the elements. We demand architecture that signals our wealth to our neighbors.
It's all about signaling. The Nafs takes the basic mechanics of survival and supercharges them into an insatiable pursuit of pleasure, dominance, and psychological comfort.
That reframes so much of modern consumer behavior, doesn't it?
It completely does. The Nafs is an engine deliberately stripped of its automatic shutoff valve. It will run hot until it runs out of fuel or destroys the car.
Which leads us to the next logical question.
Right. If this internal engine is running at this relentless RPM, what exactly is the fuel?
And the text doesn't just leave this as a vague metaphysical concept. It actually breaks the Nafs down into ancient elemental physics.
Which I found totally unexpected in a psychology text. Elements. Really.
It is a brilliant intersection of classical elemental theory and human psychology. The text explains that because the Nafs is generated by the soul's fusion with the physical body, it inherits the innate characteristics of the physical world.
And in classical thought, that physical world is constructed from 4 base elements.
Air, water, fire, and earth.
So our psychological flaws, our internal saboteurs, are not random. They are direct manifestations of these 4 elemental forces operating within us.
Precisely.
I want to really dig into these because understanding the DNA of our flaws feels like the first step to actually dismantling them. Let's start with air.
Okay, air.
When I think of air, I usually think of something light, essential for life. How does that translate into a psychological flaw?
Think about air not as a gentle breeze, but in its most volatile state. What is the nature of a sudden windstorm or a tornado?
It uproots things. It scatters everything.
It destroys the established order, and it is entirely unpredictable.
Yeah.
Psychologically, the text aligns the element of air with anger.
Anger. Okay, that makes sense.
It is that sudden, volatile, blinding urge to lash out, to lose control, to scatter the relationships and the peace around you.
It's a sudden pressure differential in the mind that demands explosive release.
And to ground this, the text pairs this elemental concept with a very famous hadith about a wrestler.
Yes, the prophet poses a question to his companions, right? He asks, who do you consider to be a true wrestler?
And they give the obvious logical answer, the one who cannot be thrown to the ground by other men.
Which is literally what a wrestler is.
Right. But the prophet redefines strength entirely. He says, no, the true wrestler is the one who controls his own nafs at the time of anger.
Wow.
He is essentially saying that physically dominating another human being is a trivial display of power compared to the monumental strength required to anchor yourself when the internal elemental windstorm of air is trying to uproot your mind.
That completely flips the macho concept of strength on its head. Real power is internal containment.
Exactly.
Okay, so air is anger. What about water? Water is usually associated with purity or calm.
In this specific psychological framework, the nature of water is defined by its relentless expansiveness. Water flows into every available empty space.
It consumes, it swallows things up.
It erodes boundaries. Think of the flood. Psychologically, the element of water generates greed.
Greed, because it just keeps spreading.
It is the urge to continuously acquire, to flood your life with wealth, resources, objects, and power, continuously expanding your territory, but never feeling that the reservoir is actually full.
Because water takes the shape of whatever container it's in. So if your container of desire keeps growing, the water just keeps spreading to fill it.
A perfect articulation of the concept. It is a boundless consumption.
Which brings us to fire. Air is anger, water is greed. Fire seems fairly straightforward in terms of destruction.
Fire consumes, yes.
Yeah.
But specifically, it destroys what has already been built, turning structure into ash.
So what's the psychological equivalent?
Psychologically, the text identifies fire as the root of envy and malice. It is the burning resentment you feel when you see someone else's success, their happiness, or their blessings, and your ego desires to burn their structure down.
Man, that is dark.
And the author provides a stark, terrifying warning here, quoting a hadith. Beware of envy, for envy consumes good deeds exactly as fire consumes dry wood.
I have to stop and think about that imagery. Envy doesn't actually harm the person you are jealous of.
No, the fire isn't in their house.
The fire is inside your house, and the fuel it is burning is your own spiritual capital.
Your own good deeds, your own peace of mind, that is the dry wood you're throwing into the furnace of your own jealousy.
It is the ultimate act of psychological self-sabotage. You bankrupt yourself spiritually simply because you cannot tolerate the prosperity of another.
Exactly. Finally, we arrive at Earth.
Earth, the foundation.
It is heavy. It sits below everything else, yet it holds everything up. When this element becomes unbalanced or dominant within the Nafs, it generates arrogance and pride.
The delusion of immovable superiority.
Yes. It is the ego calcifying, becoming heavy and rigid, convinced that it is better than the rest of creation.
And the text includes a hadith regarding this that is honestly jarring. It states, "He who has in his heart the weight of a mustard seed of arrogance will not enter heaven."
A mustard seed.
We are talking about a microscopic, practically invisible amount of pride.
The severity of that statement is intentional. Arrogance is considered the original sin of the cosmos. It was the downfall of Satan.
Right.
Even a microscopic trace of it fundamentally distorts a person's relationship with reality and with the divine.
But this is where I really have to push back.
Please do.
If we are taking this elemental framework seriously, if I am physically and psychologically constructed out of these elements, wired by my very creation for the volatility of air, the consumption of water, the envy of fire, and the arrogance of earth, isn't this entire test fundamentally unfair?
That is a very common reaction.
Right. I mean, if the manufacturer built my engine to run on these highly combustible, toxic fuels, how is it just to condemn me when the engine inevitably catches fire?
You are voicing the ultimate existential grievance. If I am designed with inherent flaws, why am I penalized for exhibiting them?
Exactly.
The synthesis provided by the text addresses this directly through the profound concept of jihad al-akbar.
Which translates to the greater struggle.
Yes. The paradigm shift here is understanding that the goal of human existence was never to be born perfect.
Because perfection already exists in other creations.
Exactly. Angels are created flawless. They have no nafs, no elemental gravity dragging them toward greed or anger.
They possess intellect without competing biological desires.
Therefore, their obedience to the divine requires absolutely no internal friction. It is their default state. They are programmed for compliance.
They don't have an engine that constantly wants to go off-roading into the mud.
They don't. Humans, however, are deliberately endowed with this volatile, elementally flawed, highly combustible nafs for a specific purpose.
So that we have something to overcome.
Yes. The text recounts a deeply illustrative historical moment. The companions of the prophet were returning from a grueling, bloody military expedition. They had been fighting for their physical survival.
A literal physical war.
Upon their return, the prophet tells them, "You have returned from the lesser struggle to the greater struggle."
The companions must have been bewildered. They just survived a war.
They ask what could possibly be the greater struggle, and he replies, "The struggle of a servant against his own desires."
He looks at men who have been dodging swords and arrows and tells them that was the easy part.
Because a physical battle has a defined perimeter and a definitive end. It requires a temporary burst of extreme physical courage.
But mastering your own elemental programming, taming the sudden windstorm of anger, managing the floodwaters of greed,
Extinguishing the internal fire of envy and breaking up the hard, arrogant earth of the ego, that is an invisible, relentless, lifelong war.
there are no truces.
None. And the text explains that when a human being successfully wrestles this flawed engine into submission and steers it toward the divine, they achieve a spiritual rank that is actually higher than that of the angels.
That completely reorients the burden of being human. The struggle isn't a glitch in the system. The struggle is the system.
Precisely.
An angel obeys because it has no other choice. A human obeys despite every fiber of their elemental being screaming at them to do otherwise. The friction is where the value is generated.
The resistance is what builds the spiritual muscle.
But, you know, embracing this internal struggle leads to a massive contradiction in how we usually talk about morality and temptation.
Yep.
We have this cultural obsession with externalizing our failures. We constantly talk about the devil, or shaitan in Islamic theology. The devil made me do it. I was tempted by dark forces.
We paint Satan as this omnipotent puppeteer yanking our strings.
Exactly. But if we already possess this internal engine churning out anger and greed all on its own, what exactly is the devil's role? How does this external boogeyman interact with our internal elemental flaws?
The theological distinction the author draws here between the nafs, the internal ego, And Shaitan, the external Satan, is arguably the most empowering concept in the entire text.
Okay, I'm listening.
It forces a complete reallocation of responsibility. The author directs us to a fascinating verse in the Quran where the divine explicitly states, "Indeed, the plot of Satan has ever been weak."
Weak, that feels like a massive contradiction to the way he is culturally portrayed. We treat him like an all-powerful adversary.
We project power onto him to alleviate our own guilt.
Ouch.
But the theology presented in this text insists that Satan possesses absolutely zero coercive power over a human being.
Yeah.
He cannot physically move your hand. He cannot force a thought into action.
He cannot compel you to speak a lie.
Right. His entire arsenal is restricted to one single tactic,
Oh.
waswasa, which means whispering, suggesting, or prompting. That is the absolute limit of his capability.
Okay, but if all he can do is whisper, why is the success rate so alarmingly high? Why are we constantly falling for mere suggestions?
Because he does not need to use force when your internal doors are already unlocked.
The Nafs.
This is where the Nafs comes into play. The true lethal danger is not the external whisperer. The danger is the Nafs Amara, the unchecked commanding self.
So Satan is entirely impotent unless he finds a willing collaborator inside your own mind.
He simply identifies and exploits the elemental desires that are already festering within your untrained Nafs.
Let me try to modernize this concept because it sounds exactly like corporate cybersecurity.
I like where this is going.
In the cybersecurity world, you have the external threat, the hacker sitting in a van outside the building trying to breach the firewall. If the firewall is strong, the hacker's plot is, as the Quran says, weak.
They can run brute force attacks all day and get nowhere.
But the real nightmare for a security team isn't the hacker outside. It's the insider threat. It's the disgruntled, greedy, or negligent employee inside the building who has legitimate access credentials.
So the hacker doesn't need to break down the firewall.
They just send a phishing email. And the Nafs is that compromised employee who willingly clicks the malicious link and hands over the administrative passwords.
That is a phenomenal translation of this ancient dynamic. Satan is merely running a social engineering campaign against your ego.
Wow.
If your internal element of fire, your envy, is running unchecked, Satan doesn't have to force you to ruin your colleague's reputation.
He just has to whisper a subtle suggestion about how unfair it is that your colleague got the promotion instead of you.
Exactly. The Nafs takes that microscopic suggestion, feeds it with elemental fire, and does all the destructive heavy lifting itself.
Which means we are wasting our time being terrified of the hacker outside. We have zero control over the external whispers of the world.
Not at all.
But this framework is incredibly liberating because it means we have total jurisdiction over the insider threat. If you train your Nafs, if you revoke its administrative privileges, and secure your internal perimeter, the external phishing attempts become laughable.
They just bounce off a secure system. You have pinpointed the exact catalyst for all spiritual and psychological growth. The realization that the ultimate enemy is not an invisible demon in the ether, but the unexamined ego in your own chest.
However, acknowledging the insider threat is only step one.
Right. The inevitable question follows.
How do you actually train this compromised internal employee? How do you upgrade the psychological security system? How do I stop my Nafs from constantly clicking the phishing links?
The author provides a highly specific, granular roadmap of psychological evolution. The text outlines 6 distinct stages of an Nafs.
6 stages. Okay.
It's an evolutionary ladder, a spectrum of spiritual maturity that every soul must navigate to transition from absolute chaos to absolute peace.
Let's break down this evolutionary ladder. Where does the baseline human experience begin? What is stage 1?
Stage 1 is the state we have been primarily discussing, the Nafs Amara.
Amar.
This translates roughly to the dictator or the commanding self. In this baseline stage, the ego exercises unchecked, tyrannical control over the individual.
It actively commands selfishness, instant gratification, and cruelty.
And crucially, the person operating at this stage is entirely beholden to their elemental desires, and they experience zero remorse.
The engine is redlining, the car is careening off a cliff, and the driver is gleefully pressing the gas pedal.
A terrifying image, but accurate. The text cites the Quranic narrative of the prophet Joseph, who acknowledges this inherent baseline, stating, "Indeed, the Nafs is a persistent commander of evil, except those upon which my Lord has mercy."
So the dictator state is total blindness. You don't even realize you are a captive. But a dictator eventually faces a rebellion, right? What causes this internal regime to crack, and what is stage 2?
The rebellion begins with awareness, ushering in stage 2, The Nafs Lawama.
Lawama.
This is the critic or the self-reproaching soul, and the theological significance of this stage cannot be overstated. The text highlights that in the Quran, God actually swears a divine oath by this specific state of being.
Swears an oath.
Yes, stating, "And I swear by the reproaching soul."
Wait, why would the divine swear an oath by a soul that is still failing? Because if it's reproaching itself, it means it's still committing the sins.
That is the brilliant nuance of this text. Why elevate a struggling, failing soul to the level of a divine oath? Because the Lawama stage represents the birth of the conscience.
Okay, I see.
Yes, the person still stumbles. They still succumb to the sudden windstorm of anger or the flood of greed. But the moment the action is completed, a powerful internal alarm sounds.
They feel sharp, agonizing guilt. They feel remorse.
The inner critic wakes up and interrogates the self. Why did you do that? You knew better.
This is a massive paradigm shift for anyone struggling with their mental health and spiritual habits. We are culturally conditioned to view persistent guilt as a pathology.
As a sign that we are fundamentally broken or inherently bad.
Exactly. People become paralyzed by their own remorse, thinking it signifies failure.
But this psychological framework frames that guilt as a monumental, hard-won victory. If you feel the pain of remorse, it proves that your spiritual immune system is finally functioning.
Because the dictatorship of the Amara relies on your apathy.
Right. If you feel guilt, it means the dictator's absolute authority has been shattered, and the internal resistance is actively fighting a civil war for control of your actions.
But let's be honest about the reality of a civil war. It is exhausting. A human being cannot sustainably live in a perpetual state of agonizing guilt and constant internal battling.
That's true.
The sheer cognitive load of fighting your own desires every single minute of every day would eventually lead to burnout. How does the system stabilize? What is stage 3?
You are entirely correct. The Lawama stage is painful and unsustainable long-term. If the individual persists through that friction, they evolve into stage 3. The Nafs Marama, the inspired soul. This is where the internal chaos begins to settle into a rhythm. The soul starts to receive subtle divine inspiration.
So the agonizing effort required to make the right choice diminishes.
Exactly. Instead of fighting tooth and nail against a desire to do wrong, the person begins to feel a natural internal repulsion toward toxic habits. They are instinctively drawn toward piety, truth, and balance.
It sounds like they are finally developing spiritual neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity, I like that.
Yeah, like in the earlier stages, the neural pathway for anger or greed was a massive paved superhighway, and the pathway for patience was an overgrown dirt trail.
Yes.
But by constantly fighting the dictator and enduring the guilt of the critic, they've started to pave the good pathway. The resistance drops because doing the right thing starts to become their default physiological and spiritual response.
That is a perfect modern neurological parallel. The friction drops significantly, and this easing of friction paves the way for stage 4.
The Nafs Mutmainna,
Munma'ina.
the tranquil soul. This is the ultimate goal for the average spiritual seeker. In this stage, a profound, unshakable peace is achieved.
So the elemental flaws, the sudden anger, the expansive greed, the burning envy, the heavy arrogance, they've been subdued.
Systematically subdued and integrated. The soul is completely at rest, its desires fully aligned with the will of the divine. There is no more internal civil war.
And this is the specific stage that the text notes is directly addressed by God with an invitation, right?
Mhm.
Yes. The Quranic verse calls out to this specific psychological state. O tranquil soul, return to your Lord.
Pleased and pleasing, which seems to bridge us right into the rarest heights of this evolutionary ladder. What lies beyond mere tranquility?
Stage 5 is the Nafs Radiya Mardiya.
Okay, that's 2 words.
It represents a state of profound dual satisfaction. Radiya signifies that the soul is utterly, unconditionally pleased with whatever reality God decrees for it.
Whether they experience immense wealth or crushing poverty.
Robust health or terminal sickness. There is no psychological resistance, no complaint, no why me. They trust the author of their reality completely.
And Mardia.
Mardiya signifies the reciprocal. God is entirely pleased with that soul. It is a state characterized not by mechanical obedience, but by a consuming mutual love.
To reach a point where suffering does not even trigger a whisper of complaint because you trust the source of the trial so much. I mean, that is almost unfathomable. Is there anything higher?
The author identifies a 6th and final stage, the Nafs Kamila,
Oh.
the perfected soul. This is a stratosphere generally reserved for the prophets and the absolute highest echelon of spiritual masters.
So what makes them different from stage 5?
At this stage, the individual is not merely maintaining their own purity, They become an active conduit of purification for others.
Wow.
They enter a state where simply existing in their presence, simply looking at them, begins to elevate and purify the nafs of the people around them. They are a gravitational force of divine light.
Okay, looking at this sweeping roadmap from the blind tyrant of the dictator to the agonizing awakening of the critic, all the way to the perfected soul, it provides incredible clarity.
It's a very robust framework.
But practically speaking, how does a person map their own coordinates? If the nafs is an abstract concept, an invisible engine, where is the diagnostic dashboard? Where is the physical or spiritual control room that actually tracks and dictates this progress?
To answer that, the author requires us to shift our focus from the invisible, overarching concept of the nafs to a very specific functional focal point. According to this text, and Islamic spiritual tradition as a whole, the absolute control room of human existence is the heart.
The heart. In Arabic, the qalb.
Correct. And the text grounds this deeply in one of the most consequential hadiths ever recorded. The Prophet Muhammad issued a stark anatomical and spiritual warning.
What was the warning?
Beware, in the body there is a lump of flesh. If it is sound, the whole body is sound, and if it is corrupted, the whole body is corrupted. Beware, it is the heart.
We have to clarify something here because modern listeners immediately think of the biological pump circulating oxygenated blood. Are we talking about the physical organ, or is this entirely a poetic spiritual metaphor?
It is an intricate weaving of both. Classical traditions did not sever the physical from the metaphysical the way our post-Enlightenment modern world does.
Right.
The heart was understood as the literal and spiritual center of intellect, deep emotional resonance, and divine reception.
So if the nafs is the engine generating power and desire,
the heart is the steering wheel and the navigation system. The heart decides which direction that raw power is applied.
And based on prophetic categorizations, the author breaks down the human heart into 4 distinct typologies. Let's run a diagnostic on these 4 hearts. What are the conditions we might find in the control room?
The first is the pure heart, known as the ajrad. The text beautifully describes it as a shining, polished lamp belonging to the true believer.
So it's clean.
It is devoid of elemental rust.
Oh.
Because it is clear, it acts as a flawless mirror, accurately reflecting divine truth and allowing the person to see reality without the distortions of ego.
Okay, so that's the ideal, the first typology.
The second typology is the polar opposite, the wrapped heart, or aglak.
Wrapped, like covered up.
Exactly. This heart has been systematically sealed off. A heavy, impenetrable covering is developed over it. This is the heart of the individual who has vehemently and repeatedly denied the truth until their internal receptor is completely bricked over.
No light can enter.
And no truth can penetrate the casing.
It's essentially a dead sensor. The dashboard is completely blacked out.
Precisely. The third condition is perhaps the most tragic. The inverted heart, the mankus.
Inverted.
The metaphor used here is a cup that has been turned completely upside down. Imagine pouring pure, life-saving water over an inverted cup.
The water simply hits the bottom and spills away into the dirt.
The cup retains absolutely nothing. The text assigns this heart to the hypocrite, someone who encountered the truth, intellectually recognized its validity, but deliberately turned away from it due to arrogance or worldly desire.
So they chose to flip the cup.
Because they voluntarily inverted their spiritual receptor, they have lost the physical capacity to hold on to any goodness.
The imagery of the inverted cup is devastating. You can be standing in a torrential downpour of truth and wisdom, reading all the right books, listening to the best advice, but if your heart is structurally inverted by hypocrisy, you will remain completely dehydrated.
It's a chilling reality.
And what is the fourth heart?
The fourth is the most complex, the most volatile, and frankly, the one most relevant to the daily lived experience of the average person. It is the two-faced heart, the musfa.
Two-faced.
This heart is an active, ongoing battleground. It contains genuine faith, but it simultaneously harbors deep hypocrisy and elemental flaws.
So it's a mix.
Yes. The prophetic tradition uses a brutally visceral, biological metaphor to describe this state. It states that the faith residing in this heart is like a delicate green plant that requires pure, clean water to grow.
Okay, that sounds nice.
However, the hypocrisy residing in the exact same heart is like a festering ulcer that feeds on pus and infected blood.
Whoa, that is incredibly graphic. It makes my stomach turn a little bit just visualizing it.
It is entirely intended to evoke that visceral reaction. The text is laying out a biological reality of our choices. The hadith concludes by stating that whichever food is supplied more consistently, whichever side of the heart you feed, will ultimately conquer the entire organ.
So it's a zero-sum game inside the heart.
If you consistently water the plant with sincerity, charity, and patience, the green plant overtops and suffocates the ulcer.
But if you feed the ulcer with daily acts of anger, unchecked greed, backbiting, and envy, the infection metastasizes and consumes the healthy tissue. It's a much more intense, biologically grounded version of that old cliche about having two wolves inside you.
Yes, very similar.
But this isn't just about two abstract animals fighting. This is about literally poisoning or nourishing the tissue of your own control room with every single decision you make. Every time I act out of spite, I am actively dropping infected material onto an ulcer inside my chest.
And to truly grasp why the heart is so susceptible to this constant oscillation between the plant and the ulcer, we have to look at the etymology of the Arabic word itself.
Oh, right. Let's look at the linguistic root.
The Arabic word for heart, qalb, is derived from a very specific root.
QLB. What is the literal translation of that root action?
It translates literally to turn, to flip, or to fluctuate rapidly.
Wait, so the organ that is supposed to be our ultimate anchor, our control room, is literally named after its inherent instability.
Yes, the human heart is fundamentally not a static, solid object. By its very linguistic definition, it is in a state of constant volatile flipping.
That is wild.
The text references a deeply poetic hadith where the prophet compares the human heart to a single feather hanging by a thread from the branch of a tree, sitting in the middle of a vast, open desert, being violently flipped upside down and right side up by the howling winds.
That explains so much of the modern anxiety epidemic. We expect our internal state to be this solid fortress of stoic calm, but our core operating system is actually a feather in a hurricane. We are designed to feel every single shift in the wind.
Which is why the concept of deliberate daily anchoring is so critical in this tradition. You cannot stop the wind, but you can secure the tether.
Right.
The text points out that because of this extreme, terrifying volatility, the Prophet Muhammad, who possessed the most perfected, tranquil nafs in human history, had a specific prayer he repeated constantly, every single day.
What was it?
O turner of hearts, keep my heart firm upon your religion. He openly acknowledged the fragile, flipping nature of the qalb and modeled the necessity of constantly begging the divine to hold it steady.
Let me build on that imagery with another analogy the text uses, which is the mirror. If the heart is a mirror meant to reflect divine light, every time we give in to the nafs, every time we feed the ulcer, it's not just an abstract sin.
No.
It is a literal splatter of black mud hitting the glass of the mirror. And if we don't immediately use the friction of repentance to wipe that mud away, it dries.
And then the next sin is another splatter.
Right. Over time, those spots merge until the entire mirror is coated in a thick, impenetrable layer of black rust, which the Quran specifically names Raran. The mirror becomes entirely blind.
That is an exceptionally accurate synthesis of the mechanics of spiritual decay outlined in the text. The compounding nature of unrepentant action literally alters the reflective capacity of the heart.
But this leads to a trap that I found to be the most terrifying part of this entire book.
The performative aspect.
Yes. Let's say I realize my mirror is dirty. I want to clean it. So I start doing good deeds. I volunteer, I donate large sums of money, I read theological texts, I pray publicly. The mirror gets polished, it's shiny again.
It appears clean, yes.
But then my elemental naf, specifically that earth element of arrogance, creeps back in through the back door. The ego looks at this beautifully polished mirror and says, you know what? We shouldn't just keep this to ourselves.
Let's show everyone.
Exactly. Let's show everyone how incredibly shiny our mirror is. Let's make sure society knows how pious and generous we are.
You have just articulated the mechanics of Riyya.
Yeah.
And you are correct. The text treats this not as a minor personality flaw, but as a catastrophic, terminal spiritual failure.
Riyya translates to performative virtue, right? Doing things just to be seen.
It is the act of performing supposedly divine or noble deeds with the hidden intention of extracting validation, praise, or status from other human beings.
So it's basically showing off.
Yes, but in this spiritual framework, Riyya is explicitly classified as a form of hidden polytheism or idolatry.
Idolatry. That seems like an extreme categorization for just wanting a little credit for your hard work.
It sounds extreme until you understand the implications.
To understand why it's so severe, we have to talk about the story the author includes regarding the Day of Judgment. Listeners, I need you to pause whatever you are doing and track with this, because this concept completely shattered my understanding of how morality and reward actually function.
The text recounts a chilling prophetic tradition detailing the very first 3 individuals who will be called forward to be judged by God on the last day.
And it is vital to note who these people are. They are not murderers. They are not corrupt politicians. They are not thieves.
Right. On paper, these three individuals are the absolute VIPs of human morality. They're the pinnacle of virtue.
So who is the first person?
The first person brought before the divine is a martyr, a man who sacrificed his very life, fighting on a battlefield for a supposedly holy and noble cause. God will present all the blessings and physical gifts bestowed upon this man, and the man will acknowledge them. Then God will ask a simple question. What did you do with these gifts?
And the man says,
The martyr will confidently reply, I fought for your sake until I was martyred.
in any human court, this is an automatic ticket to the highest levels of paradise. I mean, he gave the ultimate sacrifice.
But God, who peers directly past the action and looks solely at the condition of the qalb, the heart, will say, you lied. You fought solely so that people would call you brave. And that was said.
Wow.
The man desired earthly applause, and he received his earthly applause. The transaction is complete. Therefore, the command is given, and this hero is dragged on his face and cast into the fire.
Dragged on his face. A martyr. It is a shocking image.
The sequence continues. The second person brought forward is a deeply learned scholar, a man who dedicated his entire existence to acquiring knowledge, mastering theology, and teaching the Quran to the masses.
A completely noble pursuit.
God asks, what did you do with your gifts? The scholar replies, I learned knowledge, taught it, and recited the Quran for your sake.
And the response is the same.
God will reply, you lied. You learned solely so that people would call you a scholar, and you recited so they would call you a reciter. And that was said. He, too, is dragged on his face into the fire.
And the third.
The third is a wealthy philanthropist, a man who funded hospitals, fed the poor, and gave endlessly to charity. He is brought forward and proudly states, I left no path of goodness except that I spent my wealth on it for your sake.
Let me guess.
God replies, you lied. You spent your money solely so that people would call you generous. And that was said. And the great philanthropist is dragged into the fire alongside the martyr and the scholar.
This breaks my brain. It is terrifying because it reveals just how incredibly deceptive and highly evolved the Nafs can be.
It adapts.
It really does. The dictator inside your head realizes that it can no longer convince you to commit obvious crimes. It knows you want to be a good person, so the ego pivots.
It changes strategy.
It says, fine, we will be good. We will build orphanages. We will memorize holy texts. We will even die on a battlefield. I will allow you to do all of these magnificently moral things on the one condition that I get to feed on the applause.
That is the insidious genius of the Nafs. It weaponizes your own morality against you. It takes the elemental earth arrogance and pride and disguises it in the robes of extreme piety and charity.
It's basically a Trojan horse.
Exactly. The author is issuing a stark warning. The spiritual value of an action is entirely 100% defined by its secret internal intention.
The intention is everything.
You can have two people perform the exact same outward action, giving $1 million to build a school. If the first person's intention is pure, seeking only divine pleasure, that action elevates their soul to the highest ranks.
But the second person.
If the second person's intention is to ensure their name is etched in marble above the door so society whispers about their generosity, the Nafs has hijacked the deed. You wanted earthly currency, you got earthly currency. The spiritual bank account remains at zero.
We have to apply this to the listener's modern reality. Because while this text was written utilizing ancient wisdom, we are currently living in what I would call the absolute golden age of RIA.
Without a doubt.
We exist in an era dominated by social media, where the entire digital architecture of our daily lives is explicitly designed to quantify, track, and publicly display social validation.
It is an ecosystem perfectly engineered to nourish the unpurified Nafs.
Think about the behaviors we see normalized every day. People setting up ring lights to film themselves handing a sandwich to a homeless person?
Yes.
Influencers posting deeply curated poetic paragraphs about their own moral outrage regarding a geopolitical event. People casually making sure the spine of a dense intellectual book is perfectly visible in the background of their selfie.
It's ubiquitous.
Are we actually performing these actions for their intrinsic value? Or are we executing a performance designed to harvest likes, retweets, and societal validation?
We are constantly feeding the ego's ravenous need for applause, but we wrap it in the socially acceptable language of raising awareness, sharing my truth, or building my platform. The psychological insight embedded in this centuries-old text perfectly diagnoses the modern pathology of social media. When you outsource the measurement of your self-worth to the applause of an anonymous digital crowd, your heart biologically and spiritually transforms into that inverted cup we discussed earlier.
Because it can't hold anything.
It cannot retain any genuine spiritual peace or tranquility because it is constantly tipping over, spilling its contents out for public consumption and validation.
The Nafs thrives in this environment.
Because as long as you are focused on performing your virtue, you are distracted from actually purifying your heart. You aren't curing the illness. You're just paying for better makeup to cover the symptoms.
Which brings us to a massive practical roadblock. If we cannot even trust our own good deeds, if my own intellect, my moral compass, and my desire to be good can be so easily hijacked by my ego to deceive me into performative virtue, what is the antidote? How on earth do you fix a blind spot that you are biologically incapable of seeing?
That is the critical pivot point in Dr. Saifi's text. The author establishes a firm, uncompromising argument. Raw intellect, isolated book knowledge, and solitary self-analysis are fundamentally insufficient to purify the nafs.
But wait a minute. We have just spent the last, 45 minutes meticulously breaking down all of this incredible high-level psychological and theological knowledge. We have. Are you telling me that knowing all of this doesn't actually solve the problem?
The knowledge is necessary, but is not the cure itself. The text reminds us of a foundational theological truth regarding Satan. Satan did not lack knowledge.
He knew everything.
Satan possessed an immense first-hand understanding of the divine, the architecture of the cosmos, and the nature of reality. He had more raw theological data than any human being who has ever lived.
But it didn't save him.
All of that knowledge did not save him from damnation because his knowledge was completely decoupled from humility. He was ultimately ruined by the elemental earth of his own unchecked arrogance. Therefore, acquiring exoteric outward knowledge, listening to this deep dive, reading the book, memorizing the concepts, is merely gathering the raw materials.
So what catalyzes the cure?
To actually catalyze a cure within the heart, the text introduces the absolute necessity of external friction, a spiritual guide known as a murshid or murbi, and the environment of suba, which means righteous, transformative companionship.
This concept of companionship leads to what is arguably my favorite analogy in the entire source text. It so perfectly illustrates the limitation of self-help. Listeners, visualize this scenario. You have a glass of room temperature water sitting on a table. Next to it, you have a solid lump of sugar.
In this analogy, the glass of water represents your heart, your qualb. The lump of sugar represents raw, exoteric knowledge.
Knowledge, okay.
This includes all the theology you've studied, all the self-help books on your shelf, all the profound podcasts you've consumed.
If you just place that lump of sugar next to the glass of water, the water obviously does not become sweet. Proximity to knowledge doesn't change you.
Exactly.
But here is the picker. Even if you pick up that lump of sugar and drop it directly into the water, it still will not fully sweeten the glass. The heavy lump of sugar will simply sink to the bottom and sit there, intact and useless.
For the water to fundamentally change its nature, the sugar must be aggressively stirred. It must be agitated and dissolved until it permeates every single molecule of the water.
And so who or what is the spoon?
The text posits that the spiritual mentor, the guide, and the authentic community of righteous companions act as the spoon. They are the external force that stirs the heavy lump of raw knowledge into the fluid reality of your heart.
They provide the necessary friction.
Yes, the friction to dissolve abstract facts into your actual lived nature, permanently altering the flavor of your existence.
I am so deeply struck by how true this is in my own life. I mean, I can read all the productivity hacks in the world. I can study Stoic philosophy until I can quote Marcus Aurelius in my sleep.
Sure.
I can know the sugar is there. I can even memorize it, effectively dropping it into my brain. But without a mentor, without a community of people who actually embody those traits, who agitate my complacency, who call out my hypocrisies, who provide the friction to stir that knowledge into my daily actions, all of that philosophy is just a useless, heavy lump sitting at the bottom of my mind.
Without the stirring, it remains dead knowledge. The author drives this imperative home by referencing a legendary quote from the classical jurist Imam Malik.
What did Imam Malik say?
He provided a masterful synthesis of why isolation in either discipline is fatal. He stated, "He who learns outward law without inward mysticism corrupts himself and becomes a hypocrite. And he who learns inward mysticism without outward law becomes a heretic. But he who combines both attains the realization of truth."
You desperately need the rigid structural boundaries of the outward law. That is, the glass holding the water in place so it doesn't spill everywhere.
Right.
But you equally need the inward transformative purification, the stirring of the sugar. A glass without sugar is tasteless. Sugar without a glass is just a mess on the table. You must merge the two.
Yes. A true spiritual mentor does not merely hand you more reading material or more data. They provide a catalyst for transformation.
Because they can see what you can't.
Because they have already navigated the treacherous terrain of the Nafs, they can clearly see the blind spots in your ego that you are willfully ignoring.
When your Nafs begins constructing a sophisticated narrative to trick you into performative virtue, a true guide will dismantle that narrative immediately.
They serve as a flawless external mirror, reflecting your true, unvarnished state back to you, completely bypassing the defensive filters of your own arrogance.
And what's brilliant is that the author doesn't just leave this as theoretical advice. The final section of the text shifts from abstract psychology to incredibly grounded historical case studies.
The real-world application.
Yes. He provides narratives of individuals who had their water stirred, who achieved this radical internal transformation, not by isolating themselves on a mountaintop, but through intense companionship, radical accountability, and profound love. Let's examine a few of these stories because they prove that defeating the Nafs is actually possible.
We should begin with the profound case of Maiz bin Malik. This narrative serves as the ultimate demonstration of a Nafs that has successfully evolved into the Lawama stage, the fiercely active, self-reproaching soul.
Set the parameters of the story for us. What is the context?
Maiz committed a major transgression. He committed adultery. Crucially, he committed this act entirely in private. There were no hidden cameras, no witnesses, no one to accuse him. In the context of any standard legal or societal system, he had gotten away with it completely. He was safe from worldly consequence.
But his Nafs wouldn't let him go.
However, because his heart had been continually sensitized and stirred by his close companionship with the prophet, his awakened conscience became an unbearable weight. The black spot of rust on his spiritual mirror was physically agonizing to him.
So what does he do?
Unable to live with the internal cognitive dissonance, he voluntarily approaches the prophet, publicly confesses his hidden crime, and begs to be punished so that he might be purified.
And the prophet's response here is what makes the story so incredible. He doesn't immediately validate the confession and call for the guards.
Not at all. The prophet actually turns his face away from Maiz. He effectively ignores the confession and tells the man to go home and seek forgiveness directly from God in private.
He is offering Maiz a clear legal off-ramp. He is giving the man's survival instinct every opportunity to take control.
But Maiz's Nafs is so desperate for true, absolute purification that he refuses the off-ramp. He repositions himself in front of the prophet and confesses a second time.
And the prophet turns away again.
Maiz returns a third time. The prophet is so resistant to punishing him that he turns to the community and asks, "Is this man insane? Is he intoxicated?" The prophet is actively searching for any valid legal loophole to dismiss the confession and save the man's life.
Because the underlying ethos of the legal system is actually oriented toward divine mercy and the covering up of private sins, not exposing them.
Exactly. But Maiz persists. On his fourth explicit confession, the strict legal threshold is undeniably met. Maiz insists on receiving the ultimate fatal physical consequence so that he can transition into the next life with a completely spotless soul.
It's just staggering.
After the consequence is carried out, the community is fractured. Some observers whisper that Maiz ruined his own life unnecessarily. But the prophet decisively silences them, declaring, "He has made such a repentance that if it were divided among the entire community, it would be enough for them all."
That is the absolute zenith of radical accountability. The biological imperative of the human animal is self-preservation. But Moss's internal critic was so dominant, and his desire for a clean mirror was so overpowering that he willingly overrode his own biological survival instinct. His love for purity was stronger than his fear of death.
It is a stunning testament to the power of a fully awakened conscience. The subsequent historical narrative provided by the text shifts gears slightly.
What's the next one?
It demonstrates the mechanics of how a spiritual guide actively shatters the elemental arrogance of a student. This is the story of Baholdin Nashband, who would go on to become one of the most revered spiritual luminaries in history.
How did his mentor go about stirring his sugar?
Baholdin had reached a point in his development where his peers were showering him with immense praise and reverence.
Which is a dangerous spot to be in.
His mentor, possessing that clear external mirror, recognized that this constant adulation was secretly feeding Bahoden's Nafs. The elemental earth of arrogance was silently accumulating, threatening to invert his heart.
So what did the mentor do?
To preemptively shatter this growing ego, the mentor orchestrated a moment of extreme friction. He harshly and publicly reprimanded Bahoden for a seemingly minor infraction and then physically expelled him from the gathering, slamming the door in his face.
For a man of his elevated social and spiritual stature, the public humiliation of that moment must have been absolutely blinding. Every instinct of his nafs must have been screaming at him to defend his honor, to argue his case, or to storm off in a rage and start his own competing school where he would be appreciated.
That is precisely the reaction an unchecked, arrogant Nafs would generate. It would demand validation. But Bahoden recognized the friction for what it was, a targeted surgical strike against his ego.
So he didn't fight back.
Instead of reacting with the fire of anger or the earth of pride, he submitted to the lesson. He lay down on the dirt, placing his head directly across the threshold of the closed door, remaining there throughout the freezing night. In the pre-dawn darkness, the mentor stepped out of the house to pray, and his foot accidentally struck Bahoden's head in the dark. Startled, the mentor asked, "Who is this?" And from the dirt, Bahoden softly replied, "It is merely the dog of your court."
The dog of your court, the absolute nullification of pride. It is as if he faced the final, terrifying boss level of his own ego and simply refused to fight back, which is how he won.
Exactly.
He understood that true spiritual invincibility does not come from aggressively asserting your boundaries or fiercely defending your reputation. It is achieved through absolute unbreakable humility. You cannot knock down a man who has already placed himself on the floor.
A profound insight. By accepting the humiliation, he proved that the heavy element of earth within his heart had been entirely neutralized. He was no longer tethered by the need for human respect.
That brings us to the final story, right?
And the final narrative the author includes reveals perhaps the most beautiful mechanism of transformation. It demonstrates how the nafs is ultimately conquered, not just by rigorous discipline, but by an overwhelming sudden influx of love. This is the story of Fadala bin Umair.
This story has the pacing of a cinematic thriller. Set the scene for us.
The context is the peaceful conquest of Mecca. The Muslim forces have entered the city without bloodshed, and the Prophet Muhammad is performing the tawaf, slowly circling the Kaaba in the center of the massive crowd.
Okay, picture that.
Fadala is a man whose heart is entirely consumed by the elemental fire of hatred, envy, and resistance. He makes a calculated decision to assassinate the Prophet right there in the chaotic crush of the crowd.
He conceals a lethal weapon beneath his garments and begins systematically stalking his target, inching closer and closer.
He is the ultimate insider threat, armed and actively moving in for the kill.
But as Fadala finally closes the distance and prepares to strike, the Prophet suddenly stops walking.
He turns directly to his would-be assassin and calmly asks, "Is that Fadala?" Caught off guard, Fadala attempts to cover his intent with a pious lie, saying, "Yes, I was just walking and remembering God."
That's a frantic cover-up.
The Prophet smiles knowingly at the obvious deception. He says, "Ask God for forgiveness." And then he does something extraordinary. He reaches out and presses his open hand flat against Fadala's chest, directly over his heart.
Right over the control room? The feather in the wind?
Yes, and Fadala's own historical recounting of that exact microsecond is staggering. He stated at the very moment the Prophet lifted his hand from his chest, his kolb underwent a violent, instantaneous flip.
The inverted cup was turned upright.
All of the lethal hatred, the consuming fire of envy, the urge to murder, it vanished entirely, evaporating into nothingness. It was immediately replaced by an absolute, overwhelming flood of love.
Just like that.
Fadala testified that from that exact second onward, there was no creation on the face of the earth more beloved to him than the man he had just intended to kill.
That is radical transformation.
As he walked away from the Kaaba, deeply shaken and transformed, he was approached by a woman with whom he had previously carried on an illicit affair. She propositioned him.
His old life calling him back.
In the past, his nafs would have instantly succumbed. But now, he rejected her effortlessly, reciting spontaneous poetry about how the blinding light of his new faith had utterly shattered the darkness of his old desires.
That story illustrates something fundamental about human obedience. When we try to force ourselves to be good purely out of a fear of the rules or a fear of hellfire, it is an exhausting, miserable grind. The ego fights back every step of the way.
It creates resistance.
But when the nafs is purified by the physical, empathetic presence of a righteous guide, by that profound, forgiving touch to the chest, the paradigm shifts. Obeying the divine is no longer a burdensome chore.
It becomes a joyful, effortless necessity because it is fueled entirely by love. The engine isn't fighting the driver anymore. They want to go to the exact same destination, which serves as the ultimate synthesis of Dr. Saifi's entire manual. The text concludes by reinforcing that immersing yourself in the company of truthful, sincere people, the Siddiqun, is the ultimate safeguard for the human soul.
Because you can't outthink your own ego.
You cannot logic your way out of the nafs's labyrinth because the nafs controls the logic. But if you deliberately place yourself within the gravitational orbit of individuals who have already waged that internal war and purified their own hearts, you begin to absorb their humility, their tranquility, and their love through spiritual osmosis.
You allow them to be the spoon that stirs the sugar of knowledge into the water of your soul.
Exactly.
Well, we have mapped an immense amount of internal territory today. Let's gather the core insights of this deep dive. We began by dismantling the myth that the nafs, the ego, is an evil demon that must be destroyed.
We learned it is merely an elemental engine built of air, water, fire, and earth.
Inherently prone to the volatility of anger, the expansion of greed, the destruction of envy, and the weight of arrogance. But it is an engine designed with a purpose: to generate the friction necessary for us to choose the divine and rise above the angels.
We reevaluated the nature of temptation, recognizing that the external devil is merely a weak hacker, entirely dependent on our own compromised, unchecked nafs to hand over the keys to our internal perimeter.
We charted the 6 evolutionary stages of the soul, discovering that the exhausting, painful guilt of the lawama stage is not a symptom of failure, but the beautiful, necessary pain of a spiritual immune system waking up.
We ran a diagnostic on the control room of the human body, the heart, the qalb, understanding its terrifying linguistic reality as a feather fluttering wildly in the wind, requiring constant divine anchoring.
We confronted the existential horror of Rhea, learning how our own ego can hijack our greatest philanthropic and moral achievements, weaponizing our good deeds to feed on public applause, turning martyrs and scholars to ash.
And ultimately, we realized that accumulating raw knowledge is nothing more than dropping a lump of sugar into a glass of water.
It remains useless until we seek out the necessary friction of a mentor, a guide, and righteous companionship to stir that data into transformative wisdom.
It is an ancient, uncompromising blueprint for achieving true internal peace. It strips away all of our convenient external scapegoats, forcing us to look directly into the unpolished mirror of our own intentions.
Yet simultaneously, it provides us with the exact method and community required to polish away the rust.
It does.
So, as we wrap up this journey into the architecture of the self, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to carry with you into the rest of your week. I want you to think about the single biggest goal you are aggressively chasing right now in your life.
A very important reflection.
It might be a massive promotion at work, the acquisition of a specific house, the cultivation of a public platform, or even a reputation for being the most generous person in your community. Look deeply at the root of that ambition.
Is the desire for that goal genuinely emanating from your tranquil, peaceful, divinely aligned self?
Or, if you look closely enough, is it secretly being fueled by the elemental fire of envy, driven by a need to outshine someone else's success? Is it anchored by the heavy earth of arrogance, a desperate need to prove you are superior? Because if your ego, your unexamined nafs, is currently the one pushing the gas pedal of your life, who actually mapped out the destination.
And if you find that you are unsettled by the answer to that question, perhaps it is time to stop looking for external excuses, step out of the diagnostic muddy waters, and finally secure your house from within.
Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly profound deep dive. Take some time this week to look under the hood, examine your engine, and find the righteous company you need to help you stir the sugar. We will catch you on the next one.